We will continue with our conference. Our session is dedicated to Aristotelian reception during late antiquity, so we follow the schedule of the well-organized conference. And it's my great pleasure to invite our first speaker, Professor Jose Maria Zamora. Jose Maria Zamora is a professor in ancient philosophy in the Department of Philosophy at Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. He's at the same time the director of the department. He is also president of the Spanish section of the International Society for Neoplatonic Studies and a member of the Sociedad Ibérica de Filosofía Griega and Asociación Latinoamericana de Filosofía Antigua. Sorry for my pronunciation. And his latest publications include Éticas Griegas y Filosofía Contemporánea, Sócrates, La Muerte del Hombre Más Justo, and Neoplatonic Questions, just to mention a few of them. We are ready for your talk on the topic Cross-readings, fragments of Aristotelian ethics and Neoplatonic politics in the Summa Alexandrinorum. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning. For me it's a pleasure and many thanks to the organization and especially Professor Michele Curnis and the Collegium Politicum and Professor Francisco Lisi for the big opportunity. In this moment, my paper is for the Summa Alexandrinorum. The Summa Alexandrinorum is an epitome or compendium of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, probably written in the philosophical context of late antiquity, available in this entirety in the translation from Arabic into Latin, might be Germanus Germanicus, Bishop of Astorga. This is the splitted prima pars Nicomachea Aristotelis in 1243. The Arabic text used by Hermann for his translation has not survived. However, various fragments and the testimonies in Arabic, Hebrew, and Syriac have come down to us, the context of which are close in different ways to Hermann's Arabic-Latin version, taking into account the result of the studies devoted to the text. The first part of this paper aims to synthetically present the reconstruction of the tradition of the text of the Summa Alexandrinorum and in transfer of the Arabic and Latin word, and the second part is the analysis of the key notion and the critical from the politic two book of Aristotle in the Proclean revision and the influence for the Porphyrian Proclean context in the Aristotelian ethic and politic present in the Summa, and the analysis of the three virtues, moderatia, justitia, and the question and the principatus, a political life constitutes a school of virtue, with alums man do life and virtus life by integrating himself into a virtus collectivity. And in the conclusion, we then examine for an historical and philosophical approach the influence of Neoplatonic political philosophy, particularly of the School of Alexandria, and the translation of interpretation of the text translated by Hermann. Good. The translation by Germanus Germanicus, and the reductio Patavina, the Latin translation completed by Hermann, was based on the Arabic version of the Histahan al-Iskanhandarabi. The explicit of the text is the respect most explicit. End of the first part of Aristotle Nicomachean, which borrows the mode of theory. The remains of the second part, which borrows the mode of practice. As indicated, the biographical information available of Hermann is sped and rendered incomplete. He is probably appropriate Bishop of Astorga in 2066, before dying the position in 2072. In addition to the Latin translation of the Summa Alexandrinorum, complete Hermann produced this 5 translations. The Latin translation of Averroes, Mittelkommentari of Nicomachean Ethics, the Latin translation of the Arabic version of Aristotle Rhetoric, with the extract of commentary by Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and Averroes, the Latin translation of Averroes' Mittelkommentari of Aristotle Poetic, completed in Toledo, the Latin translation of Didascalia in Rhetoric can Aristotelis, es glossa Al-Farabi, the glossa. The translation of the Didascalia and the Mittelkommentari of the Poetic was on the start before the writing of the introduction. Hermann's description of this translation seems to show what the 3 texts, the Didascalia, will refer to the rhetoric with mention the Didascalia, and announce of the middle commentary of the poetic, on the poetic. The middle commentary on the poetic with its introduction mention the rhetoric but not the Didascalia. The partial translation of the Psalm into Castilian from the Hebrew text probably also in Toledo. For the contemporary Roger Bacon and the information provided by his biographic and examination of the list 3 translation by Hermann that the rhetoric of the Didascalia and the middle commentary of Nicomachean Ethics tend to indicate the translation Arabic skill were much better than the himself claims. Moreover, observation of certain passages in the translation, those which in particular Hermann resorted to transliteration, reveals an attitude which is not always very consistent and which it could perhaps be explained by the performance of war in parallel themes of the wars and war shock. Of course, only a more in-depth study of the translation technique used of the texts themselves will make it possible to distinguish precisely the different methods and the procedures used in each of the Arabic treaties, precisely the different methods of, into Latin by Hermann for the translation. Some initial elements have been provided in the introductory passage of the critical edition of Book 10 of Averroes' Mittelkommentari of the Nicomachean Ethics. The text of Roger Bacon, Hermann is still alive today. He is a bishop of what a very close friend, asking for books of logic and they had translated into Arabic. This is reference of the competence of logic knowledge from Germanus Germanicus and the critical mention. Good. For the Summa Alexandrinorum, the central question is the Syriac version in the beginning, and another version in context from Alexandrian school, and in the central question, this is the good as an idea. After presenting the 3 possible types of moral life, the life of enjoyment, the political life, and the contemplative life, Aristotle turned his attention to the early conception of the good. In particular, Aristotle develops a critical analysis of the Platonic conception of the idea of the good, which in summaries as follows in the version of the Summa Alexandrinorum. The chapter is absent for the version of the Summa by Hermann the German, and the integration carried out by the Reductio Patavina is explained by the aforementioned desire to produce a text more faithful to the context of Nicomachean Ethics. The absence of the chapter devoted to the critique of the Platonic idea of good represented from this point of view a very important gap, the need of the filter. The chapter devoted to the critique of the idea of good, in fact, not only marks of a break with the Platonic position, but also constitute an introduction to the later Aristotelian definition of the good, in particular of the human moral good which is the object of all the research in the Nicomachean ethics. It is thereof an essential step in the development of the Aristotelian argument, in respect of which there was the lack of criticism and position adopted by some of the main commentators of the Nicomachean. The absence of this chapter in Hermann's translation suggests that this omission was already present in the Arabic text and ultimately already in the original Greek. This is a particularly important fact for considering the context of the Summa Alexandrinorum and supports the hypothesis that placed the Alexandrian epitome in the context of development of the Neoplatonic exegesis of the Aristotelian text. Aristotle's critique of this idea of the good was in fact the subject of much debate among Neoplatonic authors, a debate that affected the exegesis of Nicomachean Ethics aus Stratius of Nicaea, commentary of Nicomachean First Book, clearly attest, as the studies Diocarinis and Steele have sought Eustratius' defense of Plato's doctrine of ideas in the result of the recovery of a Neoplatonic position that has its main source in Proclus' commentary on Parmenides. It clearly taught was series of arguments going back to Plotinus. A point common to Aristotle and Plato is the idea that all reality tends toward the good, and that therefore this good must be above all things. Starting from this consideration, Plato has made good something unique and ineffable that is the cause of all entities and is above things. In Plotinian and the Neoplatonic terms, it can be said that good must be placed above being and not being, not in the sense in the devote of being, but in the sense that is beyond an entity because it is the principle of being. Therefore, good is a position, but nothing else can assume that of the first principle and what make all things good. Therefore, bodies are called good insofar as they participate in being. The Aristotelian critique moves precisely against the concept of good. The Neoplatonic position adopted by Eustratius makes the distinction between the hypostasis and the intellect and the soul. But in the plurivocal meanings of good is held by Aristotle are consequence of perspective for which the soul seeks of the knows or the reality. The supreme God is something that is above all entity. This is the author of the Summa Alexandrinorum seems to be conditioned precisely by analogous argument of a Neoplatonic character. The question of the interpretation political book we have the in book 2 chapter 2 of Aristotle Politicas we can read this crucial statement about unity. We have many difficulties in this community of women, and the principle of which Socrates rests the necessity of such an institution does not appear to be established by this argument. Good. The essence of the city consists, according to Aristotle, of multiplicity, and such multiplicity cannot tolerate a degree of unity. In the Socratic fundamental presupposition consists in saying that the aim of the city and what at the same time is best for it is being one as much as possible, then this fundamental presupposition is wrong. More unity does translate into a better realization of a better ending for the city, but into its deterioration. Of course, with Plato as indeed I made, and the absolute unity for the city is an open question, and so it's for the question about the possible consequence of such absolute unity. This is the critical Plato in laws, sort of organic metaphor. And another question is the Aristotle political. The individual substance is, without a doubt, first in the absolute sense, as Aristotle put in the category. And schematic position is here after underlining decrease in unity from the individual to the family, and then from the family to the city. Aristotle affirmed the reversal increase in autarky, and that the city is both less united and more autarchic. According, there is in Aristotle a reversal between the order of unity and the order of autarky. Schematic one, do you can? If then unity and autarky don't go together, it is utile to require more unity, with the city achieve autarky in the good, for each thing is that which preserve them. With this principle that Aristotle gladly takes on from Plato, Republic thing, then what is good for the city coincided with its greatest autarky and non all in its highest unity. It is even the opposite in Aristotle's age, the unwavering intensification of the unity in the community of mean reverse itself as simple destructive for the city, even in which could achieve such unity, with should attempt to do it as Aristotle puts it. This is the representation, the basis of democratic state and liberty. Good. In the question in the Neoplatonic context, in his examination of Aristotle's objection, Proclus differentiates between two kinds of unity: material unity and final unity. This is a critique. Yes, this is in the beginning. Proclus focus on the central purpose of the Republic, the scopus, and the word. The first, the material unity for Proclus is responsible for making the difference disappear and bring it everything to a common denominator. The final unity, on the other hand, makes the parts of such by leading them to a common in. The term one, as Aristotle himself acknowledges, can be said in many ways. When there is a whole composite of parts, but possessing a form of its own, we can apply the one to the whole of the parts. Thus, from one approach, a syllabic is one, but from another is the letter that make up the syllable that are more properly considered ones, just as the syllabic on the to be considered of set of letters. For Proclus, the one is the source of all being. Everything that exists must participate to some extent in the one. A house, for example, must be a house. However, for Proclus considers that every whole must ultimately be composed of elements, of which must be one and indivisible. On Proclus' reading, to make the state one would be amply destroying it, as Aristotle's claim of the assumption that only make full sense of one, in that is which of indivisible element is one. Aristotle, following in this interpretation, speaks as if something thus becomes or increases to be a plurality. If a city is necessarily a plurality, then making the city one implies its destruction. Now, the distinction of the two sounds of the one dismantles this argument. Aristotle, was suggests Bornemann in 23, interprets unity in a plurality numerical sense, but is fully aware that this actuality to be understood is a very different sense as harmony, citing Proclus, who defends a strong conception of the unity of the state, as opposite to the unity of the Proclean state. Aristotle, on the other hand, sees the state as comprising many different citizens, of whom is an independent agent, having its own belief and desires, are capable of making its own particular decision. However, Proclus has indicated by the organic analogy he employs, interprets Plato as not only asserting the relations between citizens should be as harmonious as possible, but also that the state itself should be regarded as a living being that has a single life of its own. In the commentary of the Republic, in the Proclus Central is clearly stated to defend Plato against Aristotle, attack on the degree of unity appropriate for a city. The dialogue begins by admitting that the king of unity in the city proposed by Plato is clearly unworkable, since it is impossible for there to be absolutely nothing in common among the citizens. To have everything in common is equality impracticable. They must act as the body, the various sounds of the their natural function as private. The final unity of God, which is the cause of the community of affection, sympatheia, and of concord, homonia, does not answer Aristotle's main objection, centered on the criticism of the principle of specialization based on the nature of the individuals, claiming not only the diversity of function in the polis, but also the reciprocal exchange of this function, which allows for genuine diversity. Proclus replies to this objection by defending the maintenance of the hierarchical structure without suppressing the multiplicity proposed by Aristotle by ordering in according to the higher unity. In connection with the Summa Alexandrinorum, we have the possibility in the vision of the moral light of light in the Platonic and Aristotelian text is basic of the present of and in the order man moral action happiness. In the Summa Alexandrinorum, the key point in the Summa analysis of happiness is the adoption of the Aristotelian distinction between ethical and the unethical virtues to distinguish happiness of the fruit of wisdom, limited to practical level, from the deriving from intellectual activity was as theoretical dimension. The nature of relation between ethical and the unethical virtues outlined in the Summa highlights of clear preeminence of the intellectual level over the practical one, according to a model that the reference to Neoplatonism. With the intellect, in fact, choice is not possible. That is the central activity in moral life. The connection in the presence of the different levels of the assimilation to the divine outlined by the Neoplatonism. Following Plotinus is accompanied by a reflection of the different aims of the various degrees of virtue and of possibility of different degrees of happiness. Even a political life is how happiness, the author of the Summa Alexandrinorum, welcomed the idea of happiness in the proper to the plan political, out of lesser degree, of not as perfect in beatitudo. Felicitas enim ipse ipsa completa est, sufficient est, nullius egens ab extractio. In the question in the exactor, my question is the central in the seventh book. The seventh book of the Summa Alexandrinorum is in presentation of the catalogue of virtues. A final aspect of the Summa, though the highlight this is a part of the text we do in the characteristics of being foreign to Nicomachean ethics, must be taken into consideration independently. This makes it possible to clarify the cultural influence that at the origin of the composition of the Summa. The analysis of this part of the text is necessary to compare it with the corresponding passage in the Arabic translation of the Aristotelic Ethics. It was precisely from the seventh book inserted by the Arabic version of the Nicomachean, called Dulong, considers the Neoplatonic influence and elaborated the hypothesis of the Porphyrian matrix of 7 books. For me, this is the possible the projection of the Proclean influence of the 7 books. The order and the description of the virtue in the 7th book are consistent with other texts in the peripatetic tradition, such as the pseudo-Aristotelian De Virtutis et Vitis, the De Passionibus attributed to Andronicus of Rhodes, and the ethical treatise preserved in Arabica and attributed to the peripatetic Nicholas Damascenus. In this respect, it may be used to compare so to speak the index of this text. In possibility comparison is in the in the table. A minute. Yes. The text of the 7th book, continuity with Aristotelian purpose, is evident, especially in the conception of fortitude as a middle ground between audacity and cowardice, the description of the characteristics of the strong, of the space the danger of deed as not only hold the side, but for the love of virtue. In the question of the temperance is therefore defined as disposition directed to right use of pleasure, especially bodily pleasures. And this point, the 7th book offers another of the 3 virtues, liberality, magnificence, and magnanimity, considered as closely related to each other. In fact, the 3 virtues are considered as separate from each other according to the specificity of each one. Moreover, in the catalogue of virtues, we are subordinate of the cardinal virtues. The virtue that close the catalogue is the virtue of justice. The context of the treatment of these virtues in the 7th book had already been said about the figure of the philosopher king. In fact, it is the passage of the text of the Summa that the connotation of the figure, the prototype of the just par excellence, emerged that most. And is precisely the concept of justus, that structure of the exposition. This is the exact. Yes. Thus, structure the exposition. In fact, the 2 meanings of the term are distinguished. Just is that which is equal. Just is that which make is equal. Since in the case of virtue, we are talking about man action in the second meaning of right that is taken into consideration. What makes equal is because his guide to act what is proper to him, or because in whole and subtle dispute, in as a schema that follows the Aristotelian treatment and is summed up in the definition of justice as mean between the loss and benefit of goods, a definition of a political nature, as the same text of the Summa Alexandrinorum suggests by linking into the contents of the Civitas, a position present in the itinerary text considered so far. Justice is therefore a criterion of equity of the basis of which is to obtain what is proper to him, and this is true in both spheres, on the exercise of justice, in the distribution of wealth and the fixing of contrast. But in the last conclusion, the perspective, the state of agreement between Plato and Aristotle, which goes back to Alexandrian Neoplatonism, as we have treated to Eichler's frame to the Summa Alexandrinorum, and allows for an complete understanding. The Summa, particularly in the seventh book, with the text of Proclus and Porphyry, lost commentary, and in the case of Porphyry, the lost commentary of the Aristotelian Ethics, we know that Porphyry, lost commentary of Nicomachean Ethics, have not certain diffusion in the philosophical school on the 14th and 17th century in Alexandria, and later in Arabic context. The reading of the fundamental concept of the Nicomachean Ethics presented in the Porphyrian text, in concordance with the commentary on the Republic and the critique of Book 2 of the Politic in Aristotle, in Proclean text, 17th discussion, is clear for the key with the Platonic philosophy has been established as canonical, finding constituted first in the Arabic and the tenth in the Latin world. What has survived of the Porphyry commentary, and in connection with the Proclus critical of Book 2 of Politic Aristotle, present a philosophical affinity with the context of the Alexandrian Compendium. An example of this interpretation of the connection between the two planes, practical and theoretical, which is like in the treatment of the critical of the one in the city and the multi, and the figure of the philosopher king. The presence of the figure on the Summa Alexandrinorum is the context, is the seventh book, but also in the synthesis of the context of Book 10, dedicated to mental happiness, remains the most evident trace of the Neoplatonic origin of the text, to which is added the omission of the critical of the Platonic idea of the good. However, the textual evidence does not seem sufficient to confirm an attribution to Porphyrian context or Proclean context of the authorship of the work. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for your rich presentation. Now I open discussion, so your questions, please.
Thank you so much, Jose Maria, for your very interesting paper. I only have a curiosity. Are there in Summa Alexandrinorum present references to the titles of Aristotelian works? I mean, is there such an introduction as, for example, as Aristotle says in the book on politics or something similar, or not? As is to say, scholars have to deduce sources and models only throughout the text, but there are not internal helps to this investigation, or not? Which is the situation?
Thank you very much for your question. Directly, the reference for the politic in the book, no is possible the source in the text direct, but for the interpretation, this is similarly on the Proclus context and the commentary, the Alexandrian context preallegorical. Yes, it's possible, but the projection in the Summa Alexandrinorum don't is possible direct reference in the politics. Similarly, but for the exegetical context is possible only the deduction. Thank you. The context is ethic, but for the critical of the philosopher King or the question of the unity of the city, this is possible the connection, but director want the source in the book 2 of the political is possible. This is the context on compendium or ethical epitome from ethic and the connection with political. Yes. Thank you. And in the question of the Dante, the Summa Alexandrinorum, little reference. Do you know surely this is a Dante in the criticize the quality, the vulgarization of the cited. Note the Summa Alexandrinorum. This is very important. This is the convival in the Roberto Grosseteste translation, directly from the Greek in the same period. And next, the translation of the Summa Alexandrinorum. But in Italy and another country, the Summa Alexandrinorum continues. The projection and the interpretation.
Sprague was very great.
Yes, the compendium. This is a scholar context at the university. Similar Florence.
Critical edition.
And the critical vision and the translation, of course.
Thank you. And
Thank you. Professor Malaspina.
Yes, hello. I wanted to make a question, but you have already partly answered to the question. My question from an ignorant of the topic is if it is traceable, the influence of this text on the teaching, of the normal teaching in the Middle Ages of this translation.
Influence?
It is possible to know where, when, how much it was read and studied in the universities.
Yes, this is a key question. Germanus Germanicus have the cross in the foundation of the university in Spain. Is present at Palencia in the same period, and the translation, the beginning from Toledo, and the translation from Arabic to Latin. This is in Astorga, but it's a link for the cathedral instruction in the form. The Summa Alexandrinorum. The context is a scholar, clearly, for the explication in the foundation in the university in his moment. This is in the possibility for the continuity and the support for the teaching, especially for the person in the canonical philosophy. Roger Bacon, this is very clear. No, the beginning in Spain, but another, the context of Roberto Grosseteste or another question, the link with Paris, the formation of Germanus Germanicus is Paris. From Paris is the beginning and the context and the pop into his moment. But the critics of the Roger Bacon, so it's very, very clear for the translation. But the preference is from Arabic. The contestation for the translation in the, but the tu quia Saracenos tenuit secundi in Hispania. This is another critical of Bacon, but the connection with Bacon and the university in United Kingdom and the Paris and Italy is evident. The projection, the next, and the manuscripts on two in Paris and Sevilla and Venice. The expansion is very, very close of the Summa Alexandrinorum for the utility, for the explanation, the ethical question. Thank you.
Thank you, Jakub.
I will comment on this Proclus
Ah,
distinction
yes.
between a final and a material conception of unity. Partly he is obviously right, and it is remarkable how often Aristotle ignores the metaphysical background of Platonic utterances. He pretends not to understand that something lies behind it. For example, that there is a principle of oneness or of good, which is naturally not a numerical one.
Yes.
On the other hand, I think that in Plato's political philosophy, you find a material unity
Yes.
in his suggestion to make a property common and make families common. It seems to me that this type of unity is material one.
This is the big question for the Neoplatonic, the simplicity for the unity, absolute simplicity, plus, and the multiplicity, the question of the materiality and the link to the multiplicity. This is the intelligible material. But the big question is the numerical one. Do you count in his moment? But the city is possible in the unity conception for the simplest governance in his moment. This is the unity in the constitution. But Proclus criticized the book 2 of the political from Aristotle in the different contexts. The city is composed of many men, the multiplicity in the question of the materiality in the city, and the one is proper sense of the body, one organic. This is an enological, exegetal, political interpretation, but you have the very, very interesting. This is the only. In the last, the new translation, Balsit and Feinemur, this is the next in the Cambridge passage for the English translation. This is the near for the myth of air in the Republic. The myth of air, and the critic of the conception of the Republic of Choose in the beginning. Dissertation 17. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If there is no other question or very short comment, I would like to thank our speaker. I would like to thank you for your So it's my pleasure to continue with our second speaker, who is Philipp Schmitz. Philipp Schmitz is a lecturer at the Institute of Classical Philology and Comparatistics at Leipzig University, and also a member of the Seminar of Classical Philology at Ruhr University Bochum. He studied Greek and Latin philology and philosophy at Münster, Oxford, and Cologne. He has made his PhD on Cicero, De Finibus, and he's author of books. I select this one, Platonis Musa, die Carminalen Boethius Philosophia Consolatio als platonische Dichtung, which was his Habilitationsschrift, and he's editor of Theodoretus Interpretatio in Danielem, to select just these two. So, I'm happy to introduce your talk, The Family as a Mixed Constitution, Remarks on the Account of Peripatetic Politics and Economics in the Anthology of Stobaeus. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Veronica, and thank you very much for giving me the possibility to talk here. I prepared a PowerPoint as well, but the texts are rather small on that, so I recommend looking at the handout as well when I refer to the text. But if you don't have the handout, the PowerPoint will be fine as well. Little is known about the Hellenistic Peripatos' view on politics and economics due to the scarcity of sources. The most important source is a doxography that has survived in the anthology of John of Stobie from the 5th century AD. In Stebius, there are a total of 3 treatises on ethics in the 2nd book. These are a general introduction, an outline of Stoic ethics, and at the end, an account of peripatetic ethics, which in turn can be divided into 3 subsections. An overview of these 3 doxographies can be found on the handout under the Roman number 1a, or here on the screen. The account of economics and politics that I will deal with in the following can be found in the last part of the peripatetic doxography, C3, on your handout. Since it closely follows the text of Aristotle's Politics in many parts, it was usually thought to be a rather bad compilation that had no value of its own. We have no clear evidence about the author of these texts. Only for one part of the peripatetic text do we know exactly that it comes from an epitome of a certain Didymus. Starting from this passage, many scholars have attributed all 3 treatises to the same author and identified him with Arius Didymus of Alexandria, the famous court philosopher of Augustus. This identification with Arius, a friend of Augustus, was disputed by Göransson in the 1990s. According to his interpretation, also a dating to the 2nd century AD is possible. An overview of the different positions can be found under the Roman number 1b on your handout. In the following, I would like to pursue 2 aims. First, by interpreting 2 selected passages, I would like to show that the account of peripatetic economics and politics is an independent philosophical achievement that offers more than is generally conceded to it. I will argue that the text is an independent development of Aristotelian philosophy and a fine but mutilated example of the Aristotelian book of political science. Second, I would like to present arguments that make it necessary to date this treatise to the 1st century BC. Thus, at least for this treatise, an identification of the author with Arius, the friend of Augustus, Pake Göransson, could be possible. Since a treatise under discussion is a doxography, the question of the source is difficult to answer. Even if the author of the doxography could be determined, nothing is said about his sources and the author of these sources. Nor do we know whether the highly abridged form as we read it today comes from the doxographer, from Stebius, or from even later abridgments of the text. When I speak of the doxographer in the following, I always mean the text that we can read in Stebius. I will briefly discuss the possible sources for this text at the end. So, whoever is the author of these little treatises on ethics, let us now turn to the last part of the peripatetic doxography, which deals with economics and politics. There we read in text 1. The first constitution is the coming together of a man and a woman in accordance with the law for the begetting of children and partnership in life. This has the name of household, but is the beginning of a city. So we must speak about it too. The household seems to be a sort of miniature city, if the marriage brings the increase that is prayed for, and children are added and form pairs with one another. And so a second and a third and a fourth household come into being, and from these a village and a city. For it is when there come to be several villages that a city is completed. And since the household provides the seeds, as it were, for the coming to be of the city, so it does also for the constitutions. For the outline of kingship is present in the household, and of aristocracy and democracy. The relationship of parents to their children has the form of kingship, that of husbands to wives, the form of aristocracy, and that of the children to one another, the form of democracy. This version of peripatetic economics is remarkable in several aspects. For many ideas, we find parallels and also almost literal correspondences in Aristotle's writings. However, precisely the sections for which there are no parallels are of particular interest here. These can be found in bold on your handout. Additionally, I put the most important divergencies together under the Roman number 6a on your handout. In the first book of the Politics, Aristotle sets out how the polis arises from the family. But at no point there does he declare that it is the first politeia prote, a miniature city, micrapolis, or origin of the polis, arche polios. Aristotle's point is rather to show that the two things, polis and family, are different from each other. Thus we read at the beginning of the first book in Aristotle, text 2, "Those then who think that the natures of the statesman, the royal ruler, the head of an estate, and the master of a family are the same are mistaken." That the community of man, woman, and children is the first politeia and a miniature polis would have astonished Aristotle. One feels rather reminded of the Stoa here. Aristotle is more concerned with clarifying how to create a self-sufficient unit, not so much with the biological and genetic aspect. The slave is therefore of great importance to him in his account. Before he mentions children, the couple in Aristotle's account takes a slave to support them. In the doxography, the slave is not mentioned at all in the passage under discussion. After our text, the doxographer starts again and describes the household as Aristotle does. He thus provides a second definition of the household, which is inconsistent with the first and is a classical definition of the master Aristotle. This will be of importance later. Aristotle, like the doxographer, also compares the relationships between the individual family members with the individual forms of government. However, he does not use this to explain the polis from the household, since the household does not, as just explained, provide the seeds of origin for the polis and politeia. It is rather a general comparison. For Aristotle, the polis is logically earlier, text 3. Thus, also the city-state is prior in nature to the household and to each of us individually. For the whole must necessarily be prior to the part. What is the reason for this divergence of the doxographer from Aristotle, and what does this say about his theory? Did he simply not understand Aristotle? Julia Annes writes in her 1995 essay, Roman number 5 on your handout, "We have to conclude that Arius has not really understood the politics. He gives us bits of information, but he either misses the point of or does not care about something very important to Aristotle, the distinctiveness of political associations and relationships." Annes explains this failure, if we may call it like that, with Stoic influence. This may be correct, but I believe that we may trust the doxographer a little more than Annes does. We must therefore find an explanation for why the author makes the changes just listed, if we do not want to accept that he is stupid. The doxographer also deviates from Aristotle in his description of the constitutions in the family and uses different terminology, while the text in Stebius otherwise follows the explanations in Aristotle's Politics. The individual designations of the family relationships can be found in an overview on the handout under the Roman number 6b. The doxographer calls the relationship of parents to children a royal one, that of husband to wife an aristocratic one, and that of children to each other a democratic one. Aristotle does not use the same terms. In the Politics, as mentioned above, there's also the relationship of the master to the slave, over whom the master rules like a despot. The rule of the father over the son is there, as in the doxography, a monarchical one. The doxographer, however, does not speak of the relationship between father and son, but of the one between the parents and the children. The relationship to the wife in the Politics is not described as aristocracy, but as politikos. The relationship between the brothers is not dealt with in the Politics. In the Ethics, too, the relationships of the master to the slave is described as a tyrannical or despotic one. In contrast to the Politics, the relationship between man and woman is described as aristocratic, as is also the case in our doxography. There are differences to the doxography, however, in the form of rule which resembles the relationship between brothers. In the Nicomachean Ethics, the relationship is called timocracy. In the Eudemian Ethics, politeia. The designation democracy for a good form of state is un-Aristotelian. Rather, as one can often read in Aristotle, it designates a degenerate form of state. So, before we move on to the politics part of our doxography, let us briefly summarize. You may look at the Roman number 6 on your handout. Although the doxographer mostly follows the account Aristotle gives in his work Politics, in some places he deviates. For instance, in the designation of the household, the oikos, as first politeia, politeia prote, as miniature polis, micra polis, or as spermata, as seats for polis and politeia. These designations are not found in the writings of Aristotle that have come down to us. Rather, they are more consistent with Stoic doctrine. Sometimes the text of the doxographer is closer to the text of the Aristotelian Ethics, as in the naming of the individual constitutional forms. Here too, however, the doxographer deviates from Aristotle in the designation of democracy for a positive form of state, which in Aristotle always denotes a negative form. Furthermore, the doxographer composes the household in a different way in our passage. In the doxographer, it consists of only husband, wife, and children, whereas in Aristotle, the slave has an important function. Another difference to Aristotle is striking. The polis emerges incestuously from a single family, from a single household, whereas in Aristotle, several different households form the polis. We will deal with all this later. A little later, the doxography moves on from economics to politics, and we read in text 4. Cities must be ruled by one person, or a few, or all. Each of these can be either correct or bad. Correct when the rulers aim at the common interest, bad when at their own. The bad is a deviation from the correct. Kingship and aristocracy and democracy desire what is correct, tyranny and oligarchy and mob rule what is bad. There is also a rule which is a mixture out of the correct ones, or, with Usener's conjectures, politeion aristen instead of politeion archein, there's also a constitution which is a mixture out of the correct ones and is the best. Political constitutions often change for the better or the worse. In general, the best constitution is the one which is arranged in accordance with virtue, the worst that in accordance with vice. Ruling and deliberating and passing judgment in democracies derives from all, either by election or by lot. In oligarchies, from the wealthy, in aristocracies, from the best people. Here too we find the same designations of the individual constitutional forms, which differ from the Aristotelian ones. Since the doxographer has already introduced democracy as a positive form of state, which designates a negative form in Aristotle, he must also use a different term for the corresponding negative form of state. He uses the term ochlocracy, mob rule, also found in Polybius, which Aristotle does not use. In contrast to Aristotle's Politics, the mention of a mixed constitution is also new. Much has been written about this mixed constitution. Forerunners of this can already be found in Plato. Aristotle mentions a kind of mixed constitution in the second and fourth books of Politics, but not as a mixture of the three good constitutional forms. In the Peripatos we know of Dikaiakos, that he declared the mixed constitution to be the best. Photius, who has preserved the fragment, uses the same terms for the three constitutional forms as the doxographer. The Stoa also advocated this doctrine. We then find the classical form of the mixed constitution and the sixth constitution scheme in Polybius, and of course in Cicero's De Republica. Polybius also uses the same terms as our doxographer. The doxographer could therefore have drawn his theory from different sources. An interesting point in this context is one that has received little attention so far. It is true that the doxographer does not mention the mixed constitution in the first place when he compares the forms of state with the individual forms of rule in the family in text 1. However, apart from the mere proximity in the context of the book, there is another close connection between the mixed constitution and this passage. In whatever source he has found this mixed constitution, he, like Polybius and Dicaearchus, uses the new terminology, which deviates from Aristotle in both places, in text 1 and 4, that is, in the economy as well as in the politics. This is all the more astonishing as he otherwise adheres very closely to Aristotle's politics, both in the structure of the two sections and in the terminology. This suggests that he used a source in which the new theory of the mixed constitution may have played a role. There are also indications of this in the text itself. Together with the other deviations, this could give a new picture, and one could read the text differently than has been done so far. Let us look again at text 1, quoted at the beginning. The first constitution is the coming together of a man and a woman in accordance with the law for the begetting of children and partnership in life. This has the name of household, but is the beginning of a city. And a bit later, the household seems to be a sort of miniature city. As already mentioned, the designation as politeia, as well as the designation as a miniature city, is not Aristotelian. The doxographer seems to have chosen them on purpose. If this community, which, if everything goes well, as the doxographer says, according to desire, katorchen, soon consists of husband, wife, and several children, if it is a little polis and supplies the spermata for the formation of the polis and the politeia, what kind of politeia can it be? Since all three good constitutions, kingship, aristocracy, and democracy, occur in the household, this little polis can only be a mixed politeia, which is then also referred to later in the treatment of the true constitutions of the state. It seems, therefore, that the doxographer or his source was already thinking of a mixed constitution when describing the family. This is the only way to explain the otherwise strange fact that, unlike Aristotle, he constructs a family only of husband, wife, and children. In Aristotle's Politics, the slave is a decisive moment in his theory, which mainly aimed at the autarky of the system. A slave, however, is difficult to integrate into the mixed constitution, since the appropriate form of government between master and slave is tyranny or despotism. A tyranny or despotism, however, since it is a bad form of state, has no place in the mixed constitution, which consists of the three good constitutions. The doxographer has therefore simply postponed the introduction of the slave and offers Aristotle's definition later, which leads to the household being defined in two places. There are thus good reasons to assume, first, that the mixed constitution was already introduced in one of the doxographer's sources when discussing the economy, since the text was also rearranged accordingly, and second, that the second definition derives from another source and was added for the sake of completeness, without regard to the original intention of the text. The mixed constitution in the original theory could thus be explained as a natural development from the basic biological drives of man. Just as kingship, aristocracy, and democracy are found in the family, so the mixed constitution is a natural continuation of family relations and exactly corresponds to the constitutions of the oikos. That this state is the best constitution in the opinion of the doxographer, since it consists of the correct constitution, is probable. Usener's conjecture politeion aristen instead of the transmitted politeion archen is therefore plausible, but since the whole text has come down to us mutilated, not compelling. What does this interpretation say about the source as a whole? I believe that so far too little attention has been paid to the possible significance of the differences from the Aristotelian text. If one gives the author a chance, a theory can be reconstructed that may not agree with Aristotle in every point, but offers new aspects that we do not find in Aristotle and that are due to the special circumstances of the time, as answers to new questions that had not yet been asked in Aristotle. We have already spoken about the main differences. Aristotle is not concerned with the genetic evolutionary perspective in the Politics. He treats households as components of a whole, the polis, which is logically earlier. In contrast, the doxographer develops a theory that interprets the polis and its constitution of the state as a development from the household, which is itself already a small polis and provides the seeds for the coming to be of the polis and the constitution. Looking at the rest of the doxographer, We can also observe a similar procedure in the first part. There, that is in the peripatetic treatise C1 on your handout, the peripatos is endowed with an oikeiosis doctrine, which is not found in Aristotle. The oikeiosis doctrine, however, is the starting point of Stoic and not of peripatetic ethics. Briefly, the Stoic oikeiosis could be summed up as follows. Every living being is appropriated to itself from birth. Thus arise the first instinct to preserve itself and its constitution, that is, to reject all that is adverse and to seek out all that is beneficial. Thus even small children strive for that which serves their good and avoid the opposite. In addition to this oikeiosis towards oneself, there is also an oikeiosis towards fellow human beings, especially towards one's own children. The whole of ethics is then derived from the basic conditions of behavior. In contrast, Aristotle does not trace his ethics back to the first impulses of the child or of living beings. The Stoic influence, however, gave rise to the need to develop an oikeiosis for the peripatos as well, as the other Hellenistic schools of philosophy of the Stoa and Epicurus had done. The approach of finding a genetic biological explanation for a state of affairs is typical of Hellenism. It is therefore not surprising when the doxographer in both places tries to apply such an explanatory model to a different context. Through this interpretation, in the economic and political part of the doxography, the polis and its constitution are interpreted as a natural continuation of the original human behavior, and the mixed constitution is explained as the continuation of the original family relationships. But there are further parallels to this part. In the first part of the peripatetic doxography, some changes had to be made in order to adapt the Stoa to the peripatos. Here too an attempt is made to introduce a developmental aspect to Aristotelian politics. To do this, one must equate the conditions in the family with those in the state, which Aristotle resolutely opposes, as we have seen in text 2. The doxographer or his source sometimes makes use of other Aristotelian writings in the adaptation, or he transforms the whole theory, for example when he excludes the slave from the first community. As in the first part of the doxography, a foreign concept is brought to the Aristotelian ideas, and these are reinterpreted for this purpose. This has the consequence, and Annas has correctly stated this in the above quotation, that the Aristotelian idea is not preserved purely. However, this is not to be interpreted negatively, but rather as an independent development of the text. We are dealing with an independent author whose train of thought has only come down to us in a badly mutilated form due to the state of the text. A parallel to the text just quoted, and a more precise way of dating the original source, can be found in Cicero's De Officiis. The following passage belongs to the treatment of benignitas. One must feel, according to Cicero, more benignitas towards those who are more closely attached to one. It is therefore examined what the individual stages of human society are. First, the whole of humanity is taken as a starting point, and the circle is drawn closer until the family is reached. Here Cicero starts anew and begins with the basic community, text 5 on your handout. For since the reproductive instinct is by nature's gift the common possession of all living creatures, the first bond of union is that between husband and wife, the next that between parents and children. Then we find one home with everything in common. And this is the foundation of civil government, the nursery, as it were, of the state. Then follow the bonds between brothers and sisters, and next those of first and then of second cousins. And when they can no longer be sheltered under one roof, they go out into the other homes as into colonies. Then follow between these in turn marriages and connections by marriage, and from these again a new stock of relations. And from this propagation and aftergrowth, states have their beginnings. The bonds of common blood hold men fast through goodwill and affection. There are numerous similarities with the text in Stebius. As there, the relation between man and woman, who come together to beget children, is the starting point. The slave plays no role in Cicero's text either. Also striking is a precise description of the genesis of the polis, which in Cicero and the doxography, contrary to Aristotle, arises from a single family. The polis does not arise from several households, as in Aristotle, and as one would naturally expect, but only one household is the origin of the whole polis. The most striking agreement separates both texts from Aristotle. The sentence "id autem est principium urbis et quasi seminarium rei publicae" corresponds exactly to the arche poleos at the beginning of the text and to the sentence "ta spermata katapa tes genesios te poli paresien ho oikos hutokai tes politeos" later on in text 1. These are precisely the parts we do not find in Aristotle. Here in Cicero too, the biological genetic way of thinking is transferred to the doctrine of the res publica, and the res publica is explained from the basic facts of human existence. The first two books of the De Officiis in general are based on Panethius. The passage just quoted, however, does not fit well into the context there, which is also noted by previous commentators. Dyke therefore considered it probable that Cicero used another source there. What this source was like cannot be deduced from the remains in Cicero. The strong correspondences with Subius, however, make it probable that it is the same source that was available to the doxographer. Since Cicero's De Officiis does not deal with constitutions at this point, and because Cicero has already dealt with the subject in detail in De Republica, he did not integrate this discussion here. Now to return to the aim set at the beginning. How can we judge the author of the doxography or its source from what has been said? In contrast to the rather disjointed parts of the second part of the peripatetic outline, the part on the oikeiosis and the one on economics and politics are united by the endeavor to interpret Aristotle's teachings from a new point of view. That is, on the one hand, to develop the whole of ethics from the early stages of development of the living being, and on the other hand, if my interpretation is correct, to derive the mixed constitution from the first coming together of man and woman. This genetic model originated with the influential Stoa, so that other schools endeavored to adopt it. In the two cases discussed here, the result was that, while attempts were made to retain the basic tenets of Aristotelian doctrine, certain changes became unavoidable. For this purpose, the Aristotelian thoughts had to be rethought and developed in some places. This was done in a completely independent way, so that a new theory emerged, which shows the peripatos in dialogue with the Stoa, and which offers new results, in this case, the embedding of the mixed constitution into Aristotelian politics. In general, the texts suggest an author who does not cling slavishly to his models, but deals with them independently. With all the characteristics just mentioned, this source clearly belongs to the 1st century BC, when renewed interest in Aristotle was aroused by Antiochus of Ascalon, and a generation later by Xenakis and Boethos, and the esoteric writings of Aristotle were again intensively studied. The many literal allusions to the politics and the ethics clearly show that the text of the esoteric writings was available to the author. The parallel in Cicero offers a secure terminus antequem, at least for the source of the text. If now, at least for the part just discussed, De Officiis from 44 BC has been established as terminus antequem for the source, finally the question can be asked which authors could be possible candidates for the writing of the original source and the doxography. Since we know from Strabo that Augustus and Arius were friends with his just mentioned peripatetic Xenakis of Seleukeia, Philipson suspected that Arius used a work by his friend Xenakis when writing the first part of the doxography. Xenakis could thus also be responsible for the further developments of Aristotelian politics in the third part of the peripatetic doxography. This would also fit with the other testimonies about him. A text by Xenakis could be the original text used by Arius when writing the doxography. Whether it was Xenakis of Seleukeia who developed this theory, and whether it was the famous Arius who used Xenakis' work as the basis for his doxographies or not, is perhaps irrelevant. What is certain is that the author of a part of the original text is a 1st century BC author who independently interprets Aristotle's text and, following the Stoa, develops a theory that derives the mixed constitution from the natural conditions of human existence. Since Cicero also seems to have drawn on this text when writing his De Officiis, it can be assumed that this Aristotelian book of political science was widely read and influential. This explains also that Arius might have taken it as the basis for his account, which has come down to us in such a mutilated form. Augustus, who held Arius in such high esteem that he spared Arius' hometown of Alexandria, and who was also a friend of Xenakus, would be delighted that one of his friends derived his Res Publica Restituta, which he understood as an ancient mixed constitution, from the basic relationships between man and woman. Especially for Augustus, marriage was the basis of the state. Ta spermata tes genesios te poli par esien ho oikos, huto kai tes politeas. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your inspiring talk. And now I open the discussion. Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Philip, for this very interesting talk. I just don't agree that this archetes poleos is really new in comparison to Aristotle, because I read there that we should, Aristotle announces at the beginning of the 2nd chapter of 1st book that we should consider ex arches phenomena, the things how they are growing from the very beginning. And then he immediately says, first thing is that men and women are to be united. So it seems to me it's in a sense archetes poleos.
Okay, yeah. So it's the 2nd chapter of 2nd book.
Of the 1st book.
Oh,
the
first.
1st book.
So it was even nearer than I should have read it. Thank you very much.
No, sorry.
Yeah, thank you, Philip, for the very interesting talk. So just I want to ask a difference between Aristotle and your doxographer about the notion of mixed constitution. So in Aristotle's framework, mixed constitution is a kind of integration of social groups, or maybe, like the wealthy people, virtuous people, free persons, or maybe the integration of, components of the state, virtue, wealth, and freedom. But, in your doxography framework, just, in the household, we can find the variety of the form of ruling. So there is no concern about balanced power, balancing power of various people. And so in some sense, is it possible to say they still don't understand Aristotle's notion of mixed constitution, the key in Aristotelian framework? Or maybe they just change or modify the Aristotelian framework according to their concerns about the development of communities, etc. So maybe I would just want to know the differences, how you understand the differences about the theory of mixed constitution in Aristotle and your doxographers.
Yeah, I think he tried to just develop a theory of his own, and he just didn't care so much, of course, whether every detail of Aristotelian politics he couldn't retain all of that. The problem, of course, is we just have more or less this. We read almost all of it already, what we have. So, you don't know what is the rest of the text. Perhaps he talked about that. We don't really know that. So, but I think what is important is that he tried to develop a developmental account of the origin of the polis. And that is more in accordance with Stoic than with Aristotelian ones. But of course we don't have we have so little, so we can't really tell what he says more. Has perhaps said more about him.
Professor Zamora, then Professor Castaldi.
Thank you very much for your paper. I have a question about the authorship of vexata question, Arius Didymus and the connection with the Xenarchus of Seleucia. We have two references for the Arius Didymus in book 2 and the book 4 for the Stobaeus, but the Stoic projection. This is a question. Another in the link in the close is the date. If you consider Cicero used an early form of this text with writing the Finibus and the Officis, for Michelangelo Justa, this is the 15 BC, the possible the writing, but the date is a problem. This is near for the writing in Greek, and from Xenarchus or from Arius Didymus and the possibility writing for Cicero. This is my problem.
So I mean,
No, this-
if you look at Xenarchus, for example, for the dating, I think it's rather probable that he was born about 80 BCs, and so Cicero could have used it. And for Arius Didymus, we have datings like 90 or 80 as well. So, but actually, I don't really want to press it too much. I don't care whether it's Xenarchus or whether it's Arius Didymus, because it's a very German way of looking at things, and always, we have to find the author, yeah? And because everybody was thinking about it already, I just want to say it might be possible for me that it's Xenarchus or Arius Didymus, but I don't really care. I think what is important is we have I think it's rather sure that the text in Stobaeus and the Cicero and the Officis have the same source. Even, I mean, kataper and quasi is also is even translated. I mean, it must be the same text, and that's certain for me. And I think one can offer a solution what this text may have looked like, and who wrote it. I really don't care. And it might be Xenarchus. It's rather tight. You are right. I mean, if he's like 80, and then in 80 he was born, and then in 44 he uses it, but that could be. But perhaps it's someone else, and it's nothing to do with Xenarchus. And perhaps it's not Arius either. I mean, we know it's Didymus. They said ectes did epitome mes to Didymu in the fourth book, and we don't even know whether it's Arius Didymus. And then that's all very hypothetical. So I would rather go back from the author question and look at the text and ask what they can tell us.
Okay, thank you, Professor Castaldi.
I have just some remarks about your interesting talk. First of all, I was, for me it's particularly striking the sentence you quoted about the origin of family. I read that the family, the relationship between man and woman is a politeia based on the law. But we know very well that in Aristotle, the union between the man and woman is based on nature. This and their relationship is not at all a politeia. It's striking for me to read that the household is a miniature city. You said very correctly that the interpretation, Aristotle's interpretation of the origin of the polis is a teleological one and not historical. In this case, we face an historical, so to speak, project. Another question. The relationship between the relationship within the family and the political constitutions is in Book 8 of Nicomachean Ethics, where Aristotle speaks of the philia, the philia within the family. In this case, he says that in the family we can recognize mimemata of the political constitutions, but on this basis, the tradition, the doxographical tradition, built a theory of a mixed constitution that is not Aristotelian. Aristotelian never speaks about a mixed constitution, and in this, the context is just the philia, where the relationship between father and sons is a monarchy, and Zeus, the god, the father of degli dei, oddio, come si dice? The gods is the model of the good father and so on.
Yeah, you're completely right. You're completely right, and that's I think what I wanted to show is he takes Aristotelian material and wants to do something new with it. He doesn't want to be an interpreter of Aristotle. He wants to develop it and make a new theory, and then that's why perhaps I think that it's worth to look at the text and give it a chance, so to speak, what he does with it. But you're completely right. I mean, the context in Aristotle is different, and he takes the context and transfers it to a new theory and makes his kind of mixed constitution, which is probably the Stoic mixed constitution by Dicaearchus. Yeah, and then the other thing you mentioned, you're completely right, the funny thing with the katanomon. This is
the law.
Yeah,
the law
so,
in
but
this passage.
if we look at other things in the doxography, and if we look to Antiochus of Ascalon in the 5th book as De Finibus as well, one has the impression that he always his starting point is looking from the very much developed form, from the end, from the state, projecting it back to the beginning, and then something like that happens, because of course there is no nomos when you first come together, but he thinks already from the end and puts it to the end. Whether that is really inconsistent, I think it is because he does it like that, because he has in mind the completed polis and looks back on it, and that might be because of the mutilated state. But I think it is strange, and Moreau said about, everybody said, like, what is it? Yeah, yeah, you're completely right. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Omar?
Yes, thank you very much. I learned a lot from your presentation. I am in no position at all to judge your point, but I see also that this use of a seminarium, it's quite strange in Cicero. It could be effectively a clue of this source that you say. I want just to ask what do you think about, because the questions of the sources, Stoic or peripatetic, the big question is not the central in your paper, but is of course oikeiosis. If there is, if really there is Aristotelian oikeiosis or not, because if there is an Aristotelian oikeiosis, we can also think that the source is Aristotelic. But if the oikeiosis is something coming only from Stoic, even if it is presented as something Aristotelian, it's clear that there is a medium, a Stoic medium. So I wanted to know if what do you think about the thesis of Giuseppina Magnaldi? I think you know her book about, she's one who thinks that it is really Aristotelian material in it. I see that you don't quote her in your list, but I suppose that you know for in general for your studies about Cicero and Stobaeus. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I didn't talk because it is like if it's opening a Pandora thing, where archaeosis comes from, and of course, yeah, there's this point in Magnaldi, and Dillmeyer wrote a big thing about it. What I think in the end, for me, it seems like there's Aristotelian material, which, because he calls like oikeiotes, he has oikeiustai and so on, that might have given rise to the Stoic archaeosis doctrine. So for me, it seems that it is a Stoic doctrine, which has origins or was like kindled by Aristotelian doctrine. But that, of course, is not completely sure. And if we accept Magnaldi, then that opens the question again. Then it seems to not at all a Stoic development, but then it is a purely peripatetic development, which would be fine for me as well.
Thank you so much, Philip. Very interesting your paper. In general, thanks for stressing the accent on the specific skills and competencies of the doxographer, the compiler, and the same anthologist, Stobaeus himself. Then, I believe that I think that in general your reconstruction is quite close to the model proposed by Michelangelo Giusta, because in the Doxography di Etica, Giusta supposed the existence of a main textual frame that he called Vetusta Placita on ethics, and this general model would pass through the centuries, arriving to the Roman philosophy, of course, Cicero, until late antiquity, and so the anthology. Later, in secondary literature, this position of Giusta was in general rejected. But I think without a concrete justification. So I think that nowadays it will be a good opportunity to recover the Giusta project and idea towards the diffusion of this text. Very interesting the connection between Stobaeus and Cicero, of course, about the Arche Tespolios Seminarium Principium Urbis. Nevertheless, I have a little doubt, because in Stobaeus tutto de prosnomaze taimen oikos archetes polios esti. The subject is oikos, undoubtedly. On the contrary, in Cicero's text, the subject of Principium Urbis et quasi Seminarium Rei Publicae is not a feminine or masculine noun, is id autem est, is not domus. My question is, since in the previous text there are no neuter noun with the exception of conjugium, my question is, with this id, which is the subject of Principium Urbis, arche polios, not domus oikos, said something other, something different, this id refers only to conjugium, which is defined as the commune animantium libido procreandi, or in alternative, and I incline for this possibility, is the general phenomenon of this process of procreation, with various levels of social complexity. What do you think about?
I would say, like, in my view, it just takes together all of the stuff before. It's like, and we have prima societas in ipso conjuges, proxima in liberis, de inde una domus, and we have the domus communia omnia. And then all of that is referred to as it. So all of that. And
but the pronoun is not ea.
yes,
Okay,
but
so
I mean,
ea autem est, yes, of course, is dioikos, is domus. I don't know, what do you think?
it's always with principium they attract it, I think. I mean, if you do a relative clause, you would say quod autem est principium, and then it would refer to all of it. I think that's kind of normal. For me, it could be everything, and I think it's like the whole sentence. All of that is referred to by it. And I wouldn't put some. I mean, Cicero, he is looking very much at the details in his speeches, but he was in a hurry when doing that. I mean, there was difficult times, and he wrote the whole of De Finibus, the third book, in 6 weeks, and you don't know. He probably spent like one morning on that. Perhaps we looking on one very thing. I don't know whether that does justice to Cicero, but I think that it could be read really as referring to, and it's attracted because of principium.
Yeah, thank you. I ask for the last very short question and a short answer.
Thank you for your interesting paper. And some passages you have commented reminds me other passages from Dionysius of Halicarnassus and Livy, who described the beginning of the community of Rome, and for example, the marriage between Romulus and Arcilia is described as a starting point to create a monoia, concordia, and this reflects the social order in the community, and is a very good starting point for create an order in the community and to increase also the community of Rome. And do you think that these other influences on Tobias' thought, we can take account of this also along with the Stoic elements or not? What do you think about?
You mean the historians as a whole, or?
Yes, the influences from Dionysius of Halicarnassus and Greek and Roman historiography on this topic, and maybe this also can flow into the work.
I would rather think that the texts, like from the time, like the first century texts, that they had an influence on Dionysius and all the others. So that it fits very well in Augustus' politics. That's why I think, like, okay, and then of course it's fine if Arius is his friend, and Xenocrates as well, and they make their res publica reconstituta out of it. So I think it's kind of the other way, perhaps, that these texts went to the historiographers by whatever ways, than the other way. I don't think that it's influence which is then on Stobius, but you cannot really see or decide which way it goes, actually.
Yeah, just a curiosity. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the rich discussion too, and I think we can continue during the break.
Session 6 will start at 11:30 in time. Now we have our coffee break. But before, I propose you, all of you, to go down to the ground floor in the garden to make a general photo of the group of the Collegium Politico. Do you agree? So we go directly, and then we have our coffee break.
There will be no need to present him to you. We all know his research on classical political thought in Middle Ages, on classical philology, not to mention also his contribution on Dante Alighieri. Dante Alighieri. We all know, as your guests, also your research and activity connected to Lysipo, clearly. So I think the best way to present you is to leave you the floor and let you to present your paper, which is the second part of the Siete Partidas, an example of Aristotelian book on monarchy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lydia, for your kind presentation. The Siete Partidas, 7 division by Alfonso X the Wise, constitute one of the most composite, articulated, and extensive encyclopedic summae of law, political culture, and daily practices of the late Middle Ages. In particular, the second part, which, according to the indications of the manuscript tradition, deals with the emperors, kings, and other great lords of the earth who have to preserve justice and truth, represents a magnificent register of definitions and political precepts on kingship and the structuring of a modern kingdom. According to the general scheme of the work, the second partida is divided into many main titles, each one of them on a different topic and with a series of laws. The 31 titles of the second book, which bring together a total of 359 laws, offer an extremely varied index on the person of the king, his power, the administration of the kingdom, war, support for the dissemination of science, and even the regulation of the sale of books for students at university studies. As José Luis Villacañas recently wrote, the set of the Partidas offers, I'm quoting, more than a legal text, the mentality of the new kingship. End of the quotation. A mentality that the erudite scholars of the Alphonsine court did not decline in corporate terms, but rather personal and territorial. In other words, the state that emerges from the second partida is not an organic body whose functions and interactions represent the object of the research. On the contrary, the authors of the partidas focus their attention on the physical person, the nobility and the spirituality of the king. Paradoxically, it is this centrality of the king to attract numerous arguments from the Aristotelian model during the composition of the second partida. One of the most debated problems on this book is its chronology. In a 1988 article dedicated to the Aristotelian sources of the treatise, Jaime Ferrero Alemparte proposed the year 1257-1258 as the processing time of the book. More recent studies, based on the comparison of subscriptiones of different manuscripts, shift the chronology of the writing up to 1265. Moreover, these investigations have clarified that the texts were revised by Alfonso himself between 1272 and 1275, when the king was isolated in Sevilla. In relation to the quality of the Aristotelian sources present in the compilation, a chronological gap of a few years can be decisive, since this was the period in which William of Moerbeke completed the Latin translation of Aristotle's Politics, and its copies began to circulate rapidly throughout Europe. The Aristotelian auctoritas within the second partida is evident, due to the assiduity of attestations like the explicit mention of Aristotle's Politics. The Prince of Philosophers, according to the most typical definition of Aristotle in the medieval Latin tradition, is one of the favorite authors of Alfonso the Wise, who knows very well his scientific production. Nevertheless, an updated study on the Aristotelian sources of the second partida is not still available. The purpose of my paper is to suggest not only that the Alphonsine editors accessed various supports of the Aristotelian tradition, but also that the study of the recently rediscovered politics determined a specific setting of the book or a partial resetting. One perceives the influence of the Aristotelian treatise especially in the naturalness of king's power and the justification of his moral attitude on the basis of precepts and arguments that can only be read in the complete version of the Politics, but not in other apocryphal traditions very popular during the first half of the 13th century. From a structural point of view, the insistence on nature constitutes the clearest proof of the influence of the Aristotelian model on the composition of the second partida. In the political culture of the Alphonsine age, the definition of human sociality as a natural element was something capable to freeing civil institutions from the Augustinian condemnation for being a consequence of original sin. In Alfonso the Wise, this definition becomes the main axiom in order to impose the authority of the king and define his action. By nature, segunt natura in the original text of the partida, namely by nobility and intellect, the king is placed at the head of the kingdom. By nature, one must love and at the same time fear the king. See text 2 of the handout. By nature, the king's power is unique and cannot be shared. Indeed, there is no need for the king to share it. This is the warning of law number 1 at the beginning of the collection, which is a very typical Alphonsine statement. In the original text, el señorío non quiere compañero. Since nature has a divine origin, it is also possible to place the word of the prophets and the word of ancient philosophers who had reasoned on the basis of nature on the same level of argument. The Old Testament and Aristotle's assertions, therefore, cooperate in the definition of the king, as can be read in one of the opening titles of the second partida. See text 1 of the handout. On the theological level, the king is God's vicar on earth, while on the constitutional level is the head and soul of a body which coincides with the kingdom. The comparison with the Polycraticus, text 1.2, is inevitable for the corporative metaphor in general, but the internal relationships between the limbs and the head in the 7 partidas do not exist. Everything centers on the person, soul, and heart of the king, whose thought, word, and action Alfonso tries to define. The heart, in particular, is the metaphorical element that matches the head, deliberately complicating the simplicity of John of Salisbury's original image. It is no coincidence that the only explicit mention of the Aristotelian treatise, according to the traditional reference, as is to say, the title Politics, appears in the first title of the partida. See text 3 of the handout, and especially more interesting, the manuscript from the National Library of Madrid, which is the main source for the current edition. This is the unique explicit quotation of the title. I'm not so sure that here the word is politica. Aristóteles en el libro que se llama, there is an abbreviation, a compendium. Nevertheless, we can be sure that the title was known thanks to another important manuscript of the second partida, which is another manuscript of the National Library of Madrid, Vitrina 4-6, because in this last, the title is very clear. Aristóteles en el libro que se llama Politica, with double L. In reality, the previous gnoseological framework, entirely based on nature, already derives from the Aristotelian model, even if the goal of the Alphonsine jurists is to propose a conclusion on monarchy opposite to the Aristotelian one. In this paragraph, the editor is recollecting the descriptive elements that Aristotle had used for the fourth type of kingdom, which he discusses in the second part of Politics, Book 3. If some Latin commentators, such as Peter of Alvernia, and I refer to the scriptum published by Lydia Lanza, and you, in Peter of Alvernia, dwell on the heroica virtus of the rulers of this archaic age, the Alphonsine editor prefers to underline the opposition between the age of polytheism, tiempo de los gentiles, and the present era in which the sovereigns do not claim interference in the management of religious matters. This historical contrast, too, represents a progress with respect to the Polycraticus, because in the Polycraticus by John of Salisbury, the Caesaropapist image of the king as minister sacerdotum still triumphs. On a philological textual level, it is clear that el tiempo de los gentiles translates the double nexus heroica antiqua tempora of the Latin version, finally a translation of heroikoi, archaioi chronoi of the Greek model. Even the last para-etymology, the paragraph closes with, the king as a role, he is called rei because he acts as a regla. The image of the supreme judge of the kingdom derives indirectly from the same Aristotelian page, since the archaic kings had the privilege of sententias judicare. Text 3.2, and here you can read, et cumis sententias judicabant. The knowledge of justice and injustice, torturas in the Alphonsine text, in the text of the Partida, literally what is distorted, ultimately emerges as one of the specific capacities of the king, a leitmotif that connects this law with the subsequent ones. In this regard, text 4 is very promising, because the tyrannical regime is presented as a pejorative transformation of monarchy through another direct reference to Aristotle's Politics. The medieval tradition opposes the king and the tyrant on the basis of the procedure of their acting. In one case, it is law, in the other, it is arbitrariness. This is the teaching of the Polycraticus, as you can read in text 4.6, there is the difference between king and tyrant. However, that medieval literature, the medieval literature of Polycraticus, lacks the dynamic transformational factor of one regime into another, which, on the contrary, characterizes the great novelty of Politics, Book 3, the concept of constitutional metabole. The Alphonsine editors use various terms to indicate the distortion of the sovereign's implementation. See last lines of text 4, for example, concluding with the metaphor of a straight regime which becomes crooked, is the opposition between the adjectives derecho, torticero, as is to say, inclined towards the error of something contrary to the law. It is a lexical reprise of the ending of text 3. In order to confirm that this definition is choice-worthy, the Alphonsine editor refers to the book in which Aristotle, and there is a quotation, talks about the political organization of cities and kingdoms. This is very important. Text 4, in bold, the last line, como dijo Aristóteles en el libro que fabla del regimiento de las ciudades y de los regnos. This new reference to politics, very different from the previous one, generated some perplexity in a well-known commentator. Gregorio Lopez, in his highly erudite glossed edition of the Siete Partidas, published in Salamanca 1555, adds a note that refers to a passage from the Nicomachean Ethics, which precisely summarizes the outcome of the evil king who becomes a tyrant. See text 4.2 and 4.3 at the end of the page. However, the source quoted by the Alphonsine editor cannot be the Ethics, because in this law number 10 of Title 1 appear the arguments on tyranny present in Politics Book 3. Furthermore, it is absolutely impossible that the jurists of the court of the wise king refer to the treatise on ethics as the book on the ordering of cities and kingdoms. Gregorio Lopez commented on the Siete Partidas in the 16th century, making use of all the Thomistic exegetical resources relating to politics. In Thomas Aquinas, in fact, one reads the reference to the Nicomachean Ethics. But the reason for the change in the reference to the Aristotelian treatise must be another. So far, instead of insisting on Alfonso authorship, I have preferred to speak in the plural of Alphonsine jurists or Alphonsine editors. The assumption of a plurality of authors and editors allows us to appreciate distinct sensitivities within the titles of the second partida, which depend on the personal culture of each scholar. It is probable that the page on the tyrant, text 4, was written by an editor and the text 3 by a different one. Both knew the politics in detail, but if the first aggregated the Aristotelian treatise to the repertoire of ancient political thought, the second is much more detailed, since it seems to refer to a specific book of the treatise. Within the Aristotelian politics, which is the book where primary forms of government of the cities are compared with special attention to the kingdom and to the monarchy, precisely it is the third book, which constitutes the theoretical and structural model of the first 10 titles of this partida. The lexical difference between the two indications cannot be accidental. In the first case, the book entitled Politics. In the second case, the book that talks about the organization of states and kingdoms. In any case, in Alfonso's collection, tyrant is presented as the degeneration of a cruel lord, Señor Cruel in the original, who took possession of a land by means of violence or deception or treason. More than a constitutional analysis, it is a warning about the loss of control of one's ethical status. A dangerous condition the noble man can fall into. The transformation of the royal personality greatly interests commentators, as one can deduce thanks to the alternative interpretation provided by Peter of Alvernia, text 4.5 from the scriptum. I have not still read the edition of the questions published by Marco. Because Peter of Alvernia here, in his commentary, the sovereign becomes a tyrant due to a lack of power, a power not enough strong to punish injustices, as is to say, a factual weakness of the king, something which Alfonso's jurists do not even take into consideration. In addition to the specific references, the general structure of the first 10 titles of the second partida recalls Aristotle's treatise, because starting from 1286 B8, in the last chapters of Politics, Book 3, Aristotle discusses 4 fundamental questions of the Basileia and of monarchia: sovereign's wealth, corruption and transformation of political regimes, the lineage of the monarch, the army at a disposal of the king. Eventually, in chapter 16, Aristotle describes the sovereign who does everything according to his will, to dwell on the problem of the king's advisors, and go on to the conclusion that, according to nature, it is not right that there should be a king superior to the multitude and to the law. Obviously, the titles of the second partida are not dedicated to refuting this conclusion, because they are based on an opposite argumentative procedure substantiated by the arguments of Aristotle himself. Nevertheless, Alfonso's text in the first 10 titles of the second partida follows exactly this order of content, revealing an analytical study and rewriting of Politics, Book 3. The specific literary background of the editors of the second partida will also make it possible to explain the use of various sources. In some laws, the reference model seems to be the Polycraticus, linked to a theological and corporate conception of political life. In other cases, very different sides of the Aristotelian tradition coexist, alternating allusions to the work of the philosopher, more or less identifiable, and quotations from apocryphal and popular Aristotelian literature, such as the Secretum Secretorum, in at least 2 Castilian translations. Ugo Bizzarri, in his critical edition of both versions, Secreto de los Secretos and Poridad de las Poridades, suggested that they date back precisely to the years when the second partida was drafted. But despite the chronological coincidence between the laboratory of translation from the original Arabic and the anxiety of accumulating Aristotelian quotations within the partidas, these passages can rarely be treated as direct quotations. In most cases, they are paraphrases, summaries, or comments on individual episodes. On the contrary, referring to the material supports which allowed the diffusion of the Aristotelian politics in the Alphonsine age, we have to mention an artifact of exceptional importance, namely the manuscript 47-9 of the Capitular Library of Toledo, which contains Nicomachean Ethics, according to the so-called Lincoln version by Robert Grossetesta, and Politics in William of Merbeke translation. This codex is a deluxe copy on parchment with wide white margins, illuminated initials without annotations or commentaries. And you know very well this image, which is the image accompanying the incipit of the Politica, with Aristotle himself teaching, and something similar to a book, or better, a draft of political science, not on the hands of the master, but on the hands of a student. The philological quality of the transcription is very good also because a corrector at the orthotes intervened on it to indicate the corrections in the margins. Then the main copyist proceeded to integrate the corrective interventions directly into the text with an accurate graphic restoration that erases the first version. In some cases, it is possible to appreciate, like in this volume, in some cases, the excess of the writing compared to the margins reveals that there is a second version of the text. The making of this codex certainly dates back to the first years of the diffusion of politics, since this artifact is registered in the inventory of the library of Cardinal Gonzalo Pérez Gudiel, Archbishop of Toledo, also known as the Mozarabic Cardinal due to his family origins. This inventory was compiled in Toledo in 1280, the same year in which the prelate was appointed Archbishop of that city, after many years in the service of Alfonso the Wise as a notary and confidant of the king. Between approximately 1259 and 1267, Gudiel had studied civil law in Italy for 5 years, probably in Bologna. During this stay, or when he had already returned to Spain, the clergyman could obtain one of the first copies of the Politics, which at the same time can be considered one of the oldest vehicles for the diffusion of the Latin text in the Hispanic area. Probably, I think, it was the first time that the complete text of Politics reached these latitudes. It is certainly the oldest manuscript of the Merbeke versions of all those preserved. From such a model, directly or indirectly, various working copies must have been derived, humbler supports intended for personal study and annotation. None of them dating back to the 13th century is surviving, but they certainly must have circulated in the scriptorium of Alfonso the Wise. In addition to the explicit mention, sorry, I have to recover the handout. In addition to the explicit mention of the title and the argumentative procedures, the direct influence of Aristotle's Politics on the Second Partida can also be reconstructed in a third frame, thematic and related to the ethical profile of the sovereign. All the treatment of the passions which the sovereign must avoid is naturally of Aristotelian inspiration, but specifically political. In particular, the Second Partida dwells on the fury expressed by the ancient Castilian term saña. This term, derived from the Latin insania, seems to have been specifically chosen to express furor, with which William of Merbeke translates the Greek thumos. Studies on Castilian lexicography and prose see in the use of this term, saña, the manifestations of anger of the aristocratic man, of the noble knight with a strong temperament whose character transcends popular limits, distinguishing himself in both good and bad. In reality, this perception must be corrected on the basis of a comparison with the Aristotelian model, one more time deriving from Politics, Book 3. Starting from the third title of the Second Partida, text number 6, the action of the sovereign must always correspond to rationality, since reason is the divine gift which only human beings enjoy. The Alphonsine text emphasizes in many passages that natural action can only be rational, in conformity with another Aristotelian category which derives from the first book of Politics. The term chosen as the perfect opposition to reason is precisely fury, sagna, or ensañamiento, as we read in text 6. As always, from the general introduction on human beings, omne in the original text, the Alphonsine editor immediately moves on to the only example that really interests him, the king. The articulated text 7 defines the sagna on the basis of some classical sources, in particular Aristotle and Valerius Maximus, and in this case, politics is not explicitly mentioned, but the collected topics still refer to the third book of this treatise, and not to the single chapters of the Nicomachean Ethics, in which this passion is analyzed. Moreover, one can affirm that the Alphonsine editors completely omitted the description of fury, which depends on the ethical treatise. In Nicomachean Ethics 7:6, for example, Aristotle argues that thumos somehow follows reason, while desire does not. In 3:8, Aristotle compares fury and courage. None of these attenuations is taken up in the second partita, which describes sagna as a passion totally irreconcilable with rational action. The insistence on fury, sagna, takes the form of a necessary procedure in the ethical economy of the second partita. In fact, it serves to remove from the first rational agency of the kingdom, id est, the king, those characteristics that corrupt his judgment, according to the warning that Aristotle discusses in various passages of the third book of the Politics. They are text 7.2, 7.3, 7.4, and 7.5. The jurists of Alfonso the Wise were certainly struck by the application of thumos to the ruler in the Aristotelian treatise for two fundamental reasons. The first consequence is the decrease in judgment, as we have seen the king outlined in the second partita is above all the vicar of God on earth, the connoisseur and administrator of justice. The second reason is that passion transports human beings away from the law, brings them closer to animals, and makes them evil. Even the general discourse on passion ends up focusing on the sagna, since in the Alphonsine synthesis, text 7, the three most harmful passions, rage, anger, and hatred, are connected to each other, and the origin is precisely the sagna. From this one comes anger, and from this last comes hatred. Therefore, in the second partita, sagna constitutes the archetype of the worst passions, of which they must be free not only the king, but also his advisors and collaborators, as you can read in the text 7.8. The negative consequences of this passion are so pernicious that Alfonso considers necessary to suggest corrective measures, of course limited to the person of the king and the highest aristocracy of the kingdom. In this regard, the physical exercise of hunting dilutes the sagna and avoids excesses of fury in the political management. This conjunction of impetus and hunting as a form of aristocratic self-control has the effect of linking
in terms of coherence, Aristotle's politics and the great political model of Alfonso the Wise, namely Emperor Frederick II of Schwaben. One must not forget that Alfonso's mother, Elizabeth of Hohenstaufen, in Spain also known as Beatriz de Suabia, was first cousin of the emperor, and Alfonso, who for about 20 years nurtured the ambition of being elected emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, certainly knew the most exclusive and at the same time erudite book of aristocratic education of that century, as is to say, De Arte Venandi cum Avibus, personally written in Latin by Frederick II. I move on to the conclusions. Throughout the modern age, the Partidas, especially the second book, continue to be the reference text for all matters relating to the person of the king, the dynastic succession, and the relations between the sovereign and the dignitaries of the state. The collection was in force in Latin America until the modern codification movement. Until the beginning of the 19th century, it was used as civil law in the parts of the United States, such as Louisiana, that had previously belonged to Spanish Empire. Furthermore, it served as the legal foundation for the formation of governing assemblies that were established in both Spain and Spanish America after the imprisonment of King Fernando VII during the Peninsular War. As we have seen, the elaboration of this royal book of political science with encyclopedic ambitions is largely based on the rediscovery of politics and the novelty of its contents. Thanks to the work of Alfonso the Wise, Aristotle's political teaching reached an unmeasurable territory, larger and more long-lived than the empire of his impetuous disciple Alexander the Great. Thank you so much for your attention.
Many thanks for your stimulating paper. And so we can, Jose?
I agree with your word on the importance of the partidas in the juridical tradition of Spain, Latin America. Also, well, we don't have to give the impression that it was the only juridical treatise, because after there is all the corpus of the Derecho Indiano, and it's a kind of multi-normative regimes of law, together with literature, with religious normativity that can be integrated also in so the judges of this period, they can quote the Partidas, but also the Leyes de Toro or whichever other code that was approved even later in the 14th, 15th century by the Reyes Católicos or by the Felipes or later códigos. But yeah, this. For my surprise, also, when I was making research in Mexico, in the libraries, the commented edition from Gregorio, this is one of the books that is almost in every ancient library of Latin America, and not only with the gloss of Gregorio, but also with other glosses, incorporating, for example, cédulas or laws which had been given in the American territories, for example, different if it was Peru or it was New Spain, etc. Yeah, and the question I had, apart from this commentary, was with the centenary of Alfonso X. You know that there was a kind of break of new, old literature. I don't know until which point was new. But there has been writings by Faustino Martinez that I appreciate very much. Of course, by José Luis Villacañas, the biography of putting together all the Partidas as one of the legs, of the many legs of the intellectual project of Alfonso X also. But how do you, apart from the philosophical reference that you give at the very beginning from Alemparte, how do you evaluate the philosophical literature properly on the Siete Partidas? Is considered like a kind of legitimate object of interest for philosophers, more or less, or not too much?
No, not so much. First, thanks for your commentary and intervention in general. With respect to the presence of Gregorio Lopez edition in Latin America, is not surprising, because the partidas were the integration of civil law. So they were a necessary code that had to be present in each local administration. With respect to your last question, the investigation of Aristotelian sources in general in the work of Alfonso the Wise is still unsatisfactory, in my opinion, because there is a quite clear judgment, for example, with respect to the scientific works on astronomy or on biology or on history, for example, the La General Historia, but with respect to the partidas, the 7 partidas in particular, not yet, because always has been a research object by historians of law or jurists, but not philosophers. For example, in the article of the article I mentioned by Ferrero Alemparte, there is an reconstructive hypothesis between the link, on the link between circulation of Aristotelian politics in Iberian area and the access the editors, the Alphonsine editors had to his text. But it's a fantastic hypothesis that we only can reject. And why this? Because in philosophical tradition it's not so common to link the material vehicles of the textual diffusions, in one word, manuscripts and their history, with the text and its successive tradition. For example, in all the literature I analyzed, never was connected the history of this Toledo manuscript with Siete Partidas. In my opinion, it was the necessary link to allow the access in the Alphonsine court to the content, to the original Aristotelian contents.
Other question? Yeah.
Thank you very much for your paper. I have a question. I don't know if I have lost something in your exposition. One, when is more or less the time when the translation of William of Malbec arrived to Spain? You have this known that?
We have no certain data on this problem. We know that William of Malbec completed the translation. I not refer to the imperfecta translatio, which is other problem. The complete translation between 1260 and 1267.
Yeah.
This manuscript in 1280 already stayed in the library of the Archbishop of Toledo. This manuscript was realized in Italy, and I think precisely in Viterbo, where William of Malbec completed the translation, because the Papa's court at the moment was there because of civil and sanitary problems in Rome. So Thomas Aquinas was there, and received the complete translation by William of Morbecke. From Viterbo, I think, started the dissemination of the new translation. This manuscript is one of the first artifacts, undoubtedly the most deluxe one, and we have a chronological gap of few years, 1268. For this reason, I presented the manuscript with this chronological gap, 68-80. 68, William have finished the translation. 1280, the manuscript already. Yes, this is the question. The problem, when Gonzalo Pérez Gurdiel obtained this manuscript, this is a datum, we don't know which year precisely he stayed in Italy. We know that obtained a special permission of 5 years to study civil law in Italy. This is the biographical evidence, but no more detailed information. In any case, it's an artifact chronologically very close to the first diffusion, to the, if I can use this word, archetype of Morbecke.
It's like so that they know very well the text of the politics, at least the translation already, the authors of the Siete Partidas.
Yes. Other observation? Yeah, Federica?
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. I find it surprising to see such philosophical bits of philosophical theory in what essentially is a legal code, Siete Partidas. So, I mean, other parts of the text that I had read are very different, and like you said, they are rich in definitions and, in fact, very, very normative. Other parts that I've read, yes. I mean, are very prescriptive of how things are supposed to. How are supposed to function, and they give precise definitions of technical terms. And in the passages that you quoted, there's nothing like that. They are very different indeed. They're not normative. They don't have many definitions. They are rather very philosophical, as you said. So, firstly, I wonder whether the influence of the Aristotelian material essentially created compelled to write in this way, or the other way around, as in the authors or the editors, as you said, wanted to write about the merits of kingship or naturalness of power or this sanya, and then felt the need to attach that to philosophical authority. And secondly, I wonder, in any case, what motivated this choice. Also, this seems very different from what we find in other texts from the period, at least as far as I know. There's nothing like that in the Fueros de Aragon or something like that. So, would it have a political motive? Would there be a political motive?
Yes, of course. Thank you so much for your no a question, a series of questions and remarks. I try to summarize because we have to go on with the program. A collection essentially normative. Yes, you are right. Essentially, but not only. It always remains in the Siete Partida the typical medieval wisdom of encyclopedia, universal collection of all the fields of knowledge. With respect to your interesting mention of Aragon, yes, of course, Siete Partida was the projection of the personal imperial ambitions of Alfonso the Wise himself. For 20 years, he tried to be elected, and twice his name was preferred by the Council of German Electors. It was the Romanus Pontifex who rejected this candidature, and who always opposed the proclamation of Alphonse as the new Roman Empire. And why? Because Alphonse came from the same family of the excommunicated Emperor Frederick II. In Spain, this is something I always remember to my students. In Spain, in Iberic tradition, Alphonse X is known as the Wise. But in northern Italy, in the same age, the religious literature speaks about the king of Spain, of Castilla, as the Antichrist, as the evil. Yes, because he's a person who is trying to rewrite ancient Old Testament, universal history, a collection of universal science, free of the regulations of Catholic Church. So it's a personal project of imperial ambition that results quite problematic and dangerous at the eyes of Catholic Church. For this reason, I know perfectly I didn't answer to your question, but I suggest the reading of the book of José Luis Villacañas, The Intellectual Project of Alfonso the Wise, an editorial novelty of 2022.
Many thanks, Michele, for this really brilliant intervention. Only a general question. How much of the Fürstenspiegel is in this treatise? Yes. Because reading your extra, I found some some parts coming also from that tradition. It's
yes, the classical tradition of Specula Principis is of course present inside the Siete Partidas, and the Polycraticus, book 4 of Polycraticus by John of Salisbury, is the filter of the previous medieval tradition about Specula Principis. All this remains within the Partidas, but there is a new image of a king, which is the personal image of Alphonse the Wise. So, for example, of course, the king has to be the ethical model. Very often we read the word principe in the Latin sense of princeps. So there is a continuity with the ancient sources, and you have seen Valerius Maximus is quoted quite precisely in order to recollect to this tradition. But the general image is very modern, and this modernity depends, I believe, I think, especially on the rediscovery of Aristotelian politics.
May I? But sorry, Jose, just 1 minute. But the problem of chronology is completely. So I was thinking to something, but probably I'm wrong for chronological reason, because the image of kingship of the king you are describing reminds me more of the regime principum of Giles of Rome. Everything you said, it was echoing, for example, the kingship, the physical person, the nobility, the centered. Here we have also because it's also difficult to think that an encyclopedia relies on Guglielmo Merbeke on the commentaries.
Claro, yes, Egidius Romanus, or Gilles of Rome, is one of the most known authors. I wonder if in the
this is the problem,
because ancient commentators said, yes, it is clear that Alfonso have read Thomas Aquinas, have read Gilles of Rome. I'm not so sure, yes, because we have a chronological stop 1275 max, maximum, and I think that the diffusion of the regimine principum by Egidius Romanus in Spanish territories was later. Was later, because we have an interesting text, translation and commentary, which is the Castilian glossa, glossa castellana, on the regimine principum, but is a text dating back to the middle of the 14th century.
Yeah. Sure. Okay, thank you. We can go on with... It's now the turn of José Luis Herrillo. My pronunciation is not good, I know. José, until some months ago, has been a researcher at the project The School of Salamanca at the Goethe Universität of Frankfurt and the Max Planck Institute for Legal Theory and Legal History. He's now a professor at Madrid, Universitat Complutense. He has a project on Francisco de Vitoria, his antecedent, and also his influence on later authors. I skip all the rest. We can check on internet your many publications of Salamanca and other related issues, and they give you the floor.
Well, thank you very much for your nice presentation, and thank you also for the organizers, especially for Michele, who invited me almost in the last minute, and I'm conscious that I'm not specialist on ancient philosophy. I'm more a historian of ideas. And so what I'm going to do today is to offer a kind of review of a very specific passages dealing with three concepts: tyranny, extreme need, and common good, to see a little bit the dialogue from the 14th century until the end of the 16th century, going also into some scholastic sources which were writing in America, in colonial America. I think that for the antiquity this is quite difficult to be non-Eurocentric, but for me, when I look at the mirror and I see a white man getting old, almost a patriarch in some years, I have the impression that, for example, for the people working on early modern history and philosophy, we can enrich or look to this scholasticism if we observe, for example, the dialogue of these three concepts that I mentioned in the sources written in America. They don't only copy or reply what this was written in Europe. So this is the perspective, for example, that many people in America has, that anti-colonial period, who say, that is only a plagiarism, a philosophy of servitude, but this is not the case. And at the end of the presentation, we are going to arrive to these sources, to Alonso de la Veracruz, which is one of my favorite philosophers, having written in New Spain, and to Melchor Calderón, who was a disciple of Melchor Cano, a scholastic disciple of Vitoria in Salamanca, and they are writings dealing with very concrete political issues such as war and slavery. But in order to don't start building the house for the roof, I'm going to read my paper. Well, the point I would like to underline today is that one of the key intellectual issues affecting the evolution of theories on royal authority, tyranny, and resistance in the early modern Hispanic world is linked to a clear progressive erosion of the criteria of tyranny provided in Aristotle's Politics. This process of erosion took place, in my opinion, in the 16th century, and it is an erosion because I see that little by little, but there was also a special moment for this erosion, and that was the defeat of the Comunero Revolt in 1521, another one of the anniversaries that we have celebrated, commemorated. Even this one is a kind of sad anniversary. And Salvador Ruz was the organizer of the main congress in Valladolid about this Comunero Revolt at the end of the Comunero Revolt. We know that Aristotle, making use of all he has seen and read about the tyrannical regimes in the Mediterranean and the Persian Empire, wrote down in his Politics a detailed and objective list of the measures usually put into practice by tyrants, from the duty of godly reverence to the ruler, to the use of spies, the construction of fortresses, and the provocation of internal conflicts in the Republic. According to my readings, only two of these, so to say, universal criteria of tyranny mentioned by Aristotle seem to have been still a kind of trending topics in the political literature of 15th and 16th centuries. Perhaps later in the interventions about Machiavelli we will deal also about that, I think. Firstly, about these two criteria which remain still in 16th century, like trending topics: the monopoly of the government by flatterers, serving the tyrant with docility, and coming often from abroad or from lower social groups. Secondly, excessive taxation, understood as an indirect way of keeping vassals poor. We also know that during the Middle Ages, when the political and ethical Aristotle was rescued from oblivion, Aristotle's definitory criteria of tyranny were reproduced almost verbatim in writings such as Bartolus de Tirano in the mid-14th century, that has been studied by Diego Quaglioni and many scholars that you know. And this is also the tradition which prevailed at the University of Salamanca until the arrival of Vitoria as holder of the Primat Chair of Theology in 1526, coinciding not by chance with the attempt of the university to turn the page of the Comunero revolt. Before Vitoria, 3 generations of Salmantine masters, led by Alfonso Fernández de Madrigal el Tostado in the mid-15th century, and by Pedro Martínez de Osma and Fernando de Roa at the turn of the century, remain extremely faithful and dependent on Aristotle's perspectives. That has been studied also. There is a great historiography of José Lavajos and many others at the Universidad Pontificia de Salamanca, the philologists at the Universidad Complutense de Madrid, etc. Yeah? In fact, we know that Osma and Roa's main writings were commentaries to Aristotle's Politics and Ethics used as teaching materials in the chairs of moral philosophy of the Faculty of Arts and in the Faculty of Theology. Also extraordinary repeticiones dealing with specific paragraphs of Aristotle's works. In the historical literature, scholars such as Nieva Ocampo, they have shown also how drawing inspiration from the criticism with which this Aristotelian tradition regarded tyranny, the students and teaching staff of the University of Salamanca gave an important support to the Comunero revolt and acted even as spokespersons and articulators of popular demands. For example, we know for the legal sources, Ley de la Junta de Ávila, etc., that there were friars teaching at the University of Salamanca who participate also in the elaboration, even if the role is not so clear, like in the Partidas of Alfonso. They are like the hidden brains between the authority of the petitioners. Yeah. So even if this kind of easy connections between political ideologies and historical events can always be criticized as too simplistic, I think that there is some degree of truth in the case of the Aristotelian foundations of the Comunero revolt. If we give a look, for example, to the perspectives of El Tostado on typically tyrannical measures such as the compulsions of vassals to forced labor and the forced levy of taxes, servicios extraordinarios, in Castilian a matter of constant debate between kings and Cortes, even before the Comunero revolt. One can write the history of Castile around taxes. We can see Tostado's fidelity to an Aristotelian approach, according to which these kind of measures were always objective signs of tyranny and cannot be justified with an appeal to common good or necessity. One clear passage by El Tostado is his comment on the biblical passage of the first book of Samuel, 8:11-17, that you are seeing on the screen in the Vulgata. It is in fact a classical point of reference in the proto-absolutist and absolutist literature. I'm thinking, for example, in Hobbes' Leviathan, which takes it as a clear confirmation of the right that sovereigns have both to the militia and to all judicature, in which is contained as absolute power. And this is important. Well, we take Hobbes always the rational argument, the deductions, but Hobbes, especially in the last books of Leviathan, is also a great author of biblical exegesis. Yeah. Long before Hobbes, the proper interpretation of this biblical passage was also a matter of controversy among glossators. For example, Nicholas of Lyra, author of a very influent comment, had considered the admonition made by Samuel to his Israelites to be a declaration of the rights kings could claim for themselves in case of extreme need. In the passage you are seeing on the screen, Lyra considered that in such cases everything has to be presented and given for the common good. Just as in the case of the natural body, we observe that the hand or even another part of it is exposed by natural instinct for the preservation of its the body's life. Yeah. Sorry, I brought only the Latin sources, but I have translation at the end of the PowerPoint. But I didn't imagine that we will have such a big screen. I usually have made presentations with very, very small screens in which 2 pages don't fit. Yeah. So the interpretation made by Lyra in mid-14th century was criticized 1 century later in Salamanca by El Tostado. He rejected, in general terms, the perspective according to which the right that kings could claim depended on the political context, being limited in the absence of necessity and unrestricted in necessitate. Against Lyra, El Tostado underlined that no need could make licit to treat vassals as serfs. So subditus and servus appear therefore as a first objective differentiation highlighted by the Bishop of Avila. Tostado opposed also Lyra's appeal to common good, underlining that most of the conducts or measures contemplated in the first book of Samuel had to be considered as offense, injury, and were no need to secure the common good, for example, compelling the sons of Israel to plough his ground, reap his harvest, and make weapons for his wars, served only the private interest of the king, and inflicted, in fact, a great harm to his subjects. In consequence, says Tostado, they could not be requested by a king. We see then in Tostado comments a second objective distinction between the common good of the realm and the private utility of the king. It is also important that the clear distinction he makes between what he calls principatus regalis and tyrannide, something that in my opinion makes his approach to political regimes closer to the objectivist perspective of Aristotle than to the approaches of authors such as Lyra and even Aquinas, prone to nuance the Aristotelian conceptual distinctions with concessions to royal authority. In fact, even if Aquinas is not explicitly mentioned by El Tostado, his comments on the first book of Samuel could also be understood as an indirect criticism to the reference made by Aquinas in Summa Theologiae Prima Secundae, Question 105, Article 1. In his own interpretation of 1 Samuel, Aquinas had rejected in general terms that the measures listed by the prophet should be considered as potestates granted to kings ex institutione divinae. Samuel's words should instead be understood as a kind of prophetic nightmare about the misdeeds of future tyrants, usurpers of the rights of lawful kings, and robbers of their subject goods. Nonetheless, and as you can see also in the screen, introducing at the end of his reasoning a concessive clause, Aquinas conceded that it may happen, however, that even a good king, without being a tyrant, may take away the sons and make them tribunes and centurions, and may take many things from his subjects in order to secure the common good. Well, we also know that Aquinas' political perspective, including this comment on Samuel, they played a capital role in later Salamancan authors, especially when the intellectual tradition initiated by El Tostado and followed by Juan de Segovia, Osma, Roa, and others was cut off after the defeat of the Comunero movement in 1521. I like a lot this image of Aquinas that it is in Paris in the museum with Averroes. We don't see Averroes, but Averroes is at the top of the image under the feet of Aquinas, representing the power of Aquinas as authority that is going to gain also in Salamanca later, some decades later. Historians of the University of Salamanca have attested the systematic destruction of the important patrimony of books and manuscripts kept at its library just after the rebellion, those corresponding precisely to the turn of the 15th century, the culmination period of Salamanca Aristotelianism, were destroyed so meticulously that even today we only know a few texts having been written in these decades. Such a virulent destruction is not surprising if we take into account that in the turbulent context of the Comunero revolt, all late medieval debates on taxation, common good, and extreme necessity of the res publica were revived. We know, in fact, that Charles' demand to the Castilian Cortes of an extraordinary subsidy to finance his nomination as Holy Roman Emperor was among the main causes of the revolt. The procuradores of the Castilian cities, assembled in Avila in summer 1520, not only rejected this contribution, but declared themselves perpetually opposed to the imposition of any kind of extraordinary taxes, as stated in the famous Ley Perpetua de la Junta de Avila. So, in my opinion, also there is an interesting dialogue that can be made between legal sources, philosophical sources, and other kind of normative sources. And well, these writers of the Ley Perpetua, even if they are vulgarizing normative knowledge, they refer also to this concept of common good, of need, etc. Yeah? Interestingly, in this document, the Comuneros partially admitted the appeal to necessity made by Nicholas of Lyra and other scholastics, promising the king socorrer sus necesidades y a las de estos reinos, but only cuando se viere ser verdaderas y necesarias. So, in my understanding, the representatives of the cities appeal here, or are appealing here, to the right of co-decision or co-definition, together with the king, of such a situation of need. The only political treatise which survived the Castilian Civil War, Alonso de Castrillo, Tratado de República. Here you are seeing the front page from 1521, but there was with the Centenario also there were new editions published, for example by the Centro de Estudios Políticos y Constitucionales, or colleague philosopher Ángel Rivero published a new edition of the book, and it has been edited also 2 or 3 times before. Yeah. So this Tratado de República marks already the beginning of a downward slope for the Aristotelian Salmantine tradition. It was printed only a few days before the defeat of the Comunero army at Villalar, and it was written by a Trinitarian friar, and interestingly it is full of reference to the great classics of political republicanism. Cicero, Titus Livius, Aristotle is an incredible source to be read with attention, but I can only make here now a few mentions to some paragraphs. So in my opinion, this humanist allure of the treatise has given rise to many misunderstandings, to the point that in the academic literature, Castrillo used to be considered as a moderate spokesman of the Comunero movement. Yeah? So especially if you consider the normative sentence that he repeated of Aristotle, Cicero, that can be like a kind of curtain of smoke curtain. Yeah? Nothing could be farther from reality, especially if we focus on the points in dispute between the Emperor Carlos and the Comuneros. Well, alone with metaphorical passages, such as the one you are seeing on the screen, in which Castrillo presents the hive of bees as a model of political community, praising in these animals their prudencia, concierto, constancia, and above all, el maravilloso acatamiento y obediencia cerca de su rey. The Trinitarian friar addressed the delicate matter of extraordinary tributes. Not by chance, the first book of Samuel appears again here as an important reference point. You are seeing also that on the screen. And just as Nicholas of Lyra, Castrillo interprets the passage as a declaration of the rights kings could claim under extreme need. He relies on Roman history and gives as examples of such measures of extreme need the confiscation of citizens' property, the forcing of already married women or widows to procreate with other men if needed for the survival of the republic, and something that is a little strange for a writer that is a friar, for example, the stripping of religious temples, that it was practiced also in Roman history. You know that better than I. It is interesting, however, that faithful to this humanist framework of reference, Castrillo does not rely on the authority of Nicholas of Lyra, but refers to Cicero to justify this proto-absolutist interpretation of Samuel. Here you can see how he quotes the Ciceronian adage, quaedam sum in honesta quod tempore fiunt honesta, concluding his reasoning with the rather lapidary sentence that you find at the end of this paragraph. De manera que pocas cosas tan malas que ya el tiempo no pueda hacerlas buenas. Well, the arrival of Vitoria to the convent of San Gregorio in Valladolid, and his later appointment to the chair prima de Teología at the University of Salamanca in August 1526, his introduction of Aquinas Summa Theologiae as the manual for the formation of future generations of theologians, that until now, in my opinion, has been studied from an apolitical perspective. For example, historians, Beltrán de Heredia, the classical historiography on Vitoria, they assume that Vitoria was arrived to the prima chair of theology only because of the academic merits, but there were also familiar merits, political merits. His brother, Diego de Vitoria, was the key agent in the suffocation of the revolt of the comuneros in the city of Vitoria. And Vitoria was, he sent someone to Paris to bring Francisco de Vitoria, because many of the Dominicans teaching of this generation, García de Loaiza sent them to the convent, the door, the key, and you stay there for the whole of your whole life because you supported the revolt. And there was an absence that was profited by Vitoria. That has been also studied not only from a philosophical point of view, but for a historical point of view. And there are many interesting documents still to be revised. Yeah, that in my opinion, that is also an important part of the imperial strategy against the ideological foundations of the Comunero revolt. In fact, by implanting the domestic theological political paradigm in Salamanca from this period onwards, Vitoria contributed to erode the classical Aristotelian distinction between royal and tyrannical rule. We see, in fact, a replication of the domestic approach in his Relectio de Potestate Civili. This, not by chance, is the first Relectio dictated by Vitoria at the University of Salamanca, 5028. That was, the blood of the comuneros was still fresh, and Vitoria addressed this topic. Yeah, so evaluating whether the laws given by tyrants oblige in foro externo and interno, Vitoria considers it seems not, since tyrants have no legitimate power whatever. On the other hand, when a commonwealth is under oppression by a tyrant and has no control of its own affairs, and can neither make new laws nor enforce those already passed, if it fails to obey the tyrant, the whole commonwealth will be destroyed. It seems clear that in Vitoria perspective, the republic has neither an independent existence nor an autonomous capacity to act and to make laws for itself, except through a pre-existing authority that even shapes the political body. For this reason, Vitoria considers the laws passed by a tyrant to be binding, and he says, not to be sure because they are passed by the tyrant, but because they have the Commonwealth's consent, since utility and respect are better served by obedience to a tyrant's laws than by disobedience to all law. It would obviously be to the detriment of the Commonwealth, were some prince with no just title to topple the government, that there should be no court, no way to arraign criminal, no punishment for those who commit injustice. Yet this would be the inevitable result if the laws of a tyrant emperor were not binding. Well, I'm quoting the translation made by Pagden in 91 in Cambridge. That is the reference in the English literature. Yeah. So, not only this kind of reevaluation of tyranny as a lesser evil if compared with anarchy, foreign subjugation and civil war, but also Vitoria's perspective on fiscal issues illustrate well the death of the Aristotelian Salmantine tradition, as you can see on the screen. For Vitoria, whether or not a tribute is in accordance with custom is no longer a relevant point. The payment of any tribute required for the common good and the defense of the res publica is both a legal obligation and a moral religious duty whose transgression implies a mortal sin. Vitoria goes even further by specifying that even when the instituted authority demands something not strictly necessary for the Commonwealth, disobedience would be sinful, in this case a venial sin. It is also important to underline that, contrary to the petitions of the comuneros in the Junta de Ávila, Vitoria leaves in the hands of the kings the definitions of such situations of need requiring extraordinary tributes. A quick contrast between Vitoria's political perspective and those presented at close dates in other Iberian faculties of theology offer quite significant results. In the Portuguese kingdom, Francisco de Monzón, and I owe this reference to Marco Toste, both of them, Lidia Lanza, Marco Toste, they have an impressive knowledge of the scholastic Portuguese literature made by Spaniards, that only by the way that they leave Spain at a certain moment, they are not so studied by the Spanish historiographical tradition. Yeah? So this Francisco de Monzón was one of the many Castilian professors hired by King João III to promote the recently restored University of Coimbra, and he followed almost verbatim Lira, Aquinas and Vitoria's arguments on extraordinary tributes, even if he had been trained at the University of Alcalá and had no academic ties with Vitoria and Salamanca. In his Libro Segundo, Del Espejo del Príncipe Cristiano, from 44, but there was only a contemporary edition, a 16th century edition of the first book, and the second book, by reason that we don't know, remained in manuscript, and it was only published some years ago by Fernández Travieso in 2012. Yeah? So in this Libro Segundo, Monzón recommended kings to avoid as far as possible the imposition of this kind of taxes, hated by the three states of the kingdom, and frequent case of rebellions. Nevertheless, Monzón granted kings the potestas to impose them in case of what he calls an urgent need, necesidad urgente. By the way, as you can see on the screen, he seems to hold a fairly broad conception of public urgent necessities, and he includes, for example, expenses to be met by the kings and his relatives, for example, such as raising the dowry of a daughter or knighting one of his sons. Well, it is doubtful if this is in regard with military, the obligation, fulfillment of military obligations or not, yeah? Well, I don't want to close my presentation, as I said at the very beginning, without going beyond Europe and mentioning, even if very briefly, the global effect of this new paradigm of tyranny and fiscality which replaced previous Aristotelian perspectives. The echoes of these debates had in fact a rapid global impact and can be retraced in America, where many issues related to land ownership, tributes and forced labor, servicios personales in the Castilian of the time, requested from native vassals, took as a starting point previous scholastic debates on the limits of royal authority, licit and illicit taxation. So when Alonso de la Veracruz, that you have here on the screen, is one of the first disciples of Francisco de Vitoria, who studied with him already in the late 1520s, and later on he was Augustinian missionary in Mexico. He taught at Tiripetío, that was the first convent in which superior studies were taught in New Spain, in continental America. And here you can see a idealized vision of his cathedra in Mexico, having, for example, indigenous, even indigenous disciples. One of them, the brown hair, skin one, is the son of the last king of Michoacán, the Calzoncin of Michoacán. It is a very curious person, because he has also scholastic writings on his own, and he bought even a Greek slave, teaching him at home Greek. So this indigenous prince, there are like events or persons that we don't imagine in this colonial context. Yeah. So when this Alonso de la Veracruz arrived to Mexico and began to pronounce himself about these urgent needs, urgent problems to be solved and in Mexico, by the way, he was also one of the first masters of theology at the University of Mexico, which was founded at the middle of the 16th century, intervening in land ownership and tributary issues, being debated in contemporary Spanish America with a relectio which follows partially Vitoria Relectio de Indies. This is the name of the Relectio by Veracruz is the Dominium Fidelium de Justo Bello, and it's the first Relectio which was written and read in an American university. He came back precisely to what Aquinas, Tostado, and others had said about extreme necessity and common good. You can see here the fragment, the reference to Abulensis, Tostado, to Lira, and others. Well, Veracruz, cultural translation of Aquinas' doctrines to the Western Indies, implied that in case of necessity, the emperor could dispose of native goods as if they were their own possessions. That reasoning applied even to native persons and workforce, given that the Spanish colonies were needed to secure the temporal and spiritual good of the Commonwealth. Native lands, especially if they were communal, superfluous, or not cultivated by the local populations, they could be distributed to the Spaniards wanting to build estancias, caballerías de tierra, molinos, that's to say, cultivating or having farms. We appreciate here an interesting and very colonial definition, up to my understanding, of common good as achievement of an evangelization process requiring above all the conservation of the New World in Spanish hands. On its own, the extreme necessity to be remediated seems to be here that of the indigenous Spanish colonies who, lacking of goods and lands, will shortly abandon America, and then the evangelization process would be interrupted. Yeah. Another very interesting scholastic source, writing, and I'm finishing, and almost finishing, source writing in this colonial context is a tratado de la importancia y utilidad que hay en dar por esclavos a los indios rebelados de Chile, that was written at the end of the 16th century by Melchor Calderón, that was this disciple of Melchor Cano at the University of Salamanca. And well, after having completed his studies of theology, he sailed also to America and became treasurer of the cathedral in Santiago de Chile. Calderón Tratado was one of the documents that the procuradores of the Kingdom of Chile presented to the Consejo de Indias, that was the council, the royal council in charge of the administration of American affairs. Yeah. When he presented this tratado as part of the claims of the colonies of Chile against the rebel native Mapuche populations at the end of 16th century. And if you follow a little bit the news on Latin America, the Mapuche is an indigenous population who is still in fighting for their rights. That was a crucial issue in the last constitution of Chile. Yeah? Little before, the Mapuche have managed, in fact, to destroy 7 small cities established by the Spaniards southern to the Bio River in a resounding defeat that was strategically presented by Calderón as others as a rebellion. So, from all the cities that the Spaniards has established, almost half of the cities southern to the Bio River, they were destroyed by the Mapuche, and then that was an scholastic response to this problem. So we can consider that Calderón went even a step further in the above-mentioned erosion of the Aristotelian perspective on tyranny, not only because he erred in favor of enslaving the Mapuche rebels to punish their violent rejection of the Spanish domination, but also and especially because of the radical realism and pragmatism of his appeal to common good and extreme necessity in the problematic frontier context of Chile. What we see in this tratado, written in vernacular, is that before entering into the typical scholastic evaluation of the different juridical and theological arguments which could determine the justice or injustice of a certain measure, in this case is the war against the Mapuche and their enslavement. Calderón, the first pages of the treatise are not about the justice or injustice, but he prejudged the policies according to its pure utility. The beginning of Calderón's treatise on the Chilean wars is in fact a dramatic account on the economic and military situation of the Spanish settlements already ruined or in troubles. According to his argumentos de importancia o utilidad, only a drastic increase in the number of indigenous slaves serving the few Spanish colonies living in Chile, too poor to pay slaves imported from Africa, would make Chile an attractive destination for other Spaniards. Independently from its justice or injustice, the enslavement of the Mapuche people was then indispensable for the survival of the colonial and evangelizing enterprise. Well, I think, and this is an hypothesis that can be criticized, it's only my reading of this long chain of text. I think that the argumentation of this third generation member of the School of Salamanca can be seen as the culmination of the decline of 15th century Salamanca Aristotelianism. It reflects the specific radicalization of previous appeals to extreme necessity and common good, which took place in the most conflicting colonial context. Those appeals are transformed here into a purely pragmatic approach to key political issues and in a discourse justifying the degradation of vassals of the Spanish kings, such as the Mapuche. So that was the juridical status of the Mapuche. Another indigenous population in America was that of vassals from the very beginning. That Isabel la Católica has stated that already at the beginning of 16th century. But what we see here is a degradation of these vassals, such as the Mapuche, into enslaved by different causes. Yeah, something that, according to the words of El Tostado, that we quoted at the very beginning of our presentation, was not only illegitimate but something almost inconceivable. Yeah, thank you very much.
Can we go a little bit later to lunch and give some? Okay. So we have time for discussion of yes. No, before. Okay. Just.
Thank you. It was. I'm absolute ignorant about everything here, and I am very happy to listen to you. So thank you very much for your paper.
Thank you.
I was wondering, how could they possibly persuade these Indians, these Mapuches, or and give us as a reason to make them slaves instead of vassals by using evangelization? How can you possibly combine the two, making them slaves and at the same time proposing the rules that come with the evangelization? I can't understand that. So I appreciated the way you explained us how Aristotle was erosion or destroyed, because justice is not important as far as I see. But then how can they give us a reason to do that, to enslave these people? Any possible idea? Thank you.
Well, the Spanish, that is a very, very important question, the key question, how they manage to justify the enslavement of vassals. Because what Vitoria has thematized in the Relectio de Indis was the possibility of making vassals, of making slaves, but indigenous population that were still being conquered, that there was no pact, no obedience to the kings. They were not converted to Christianity, and here it's a kind of second step of the process of domination, subjugation of America. We are not no more in the first half of the 16th century, the conquest process, but we are in the process of in the period of revolts, of what they strategically present as revolts. And they are going to forge, even if they are disciples of this Melchor Calderón is a disciple of Melchor Cano. But if you read what Melchor Cano says about the wars in America, the Indian has nothing to see with his disciple, with Melchor Calderón. The historiography used to assume that there is Vitoria, the great brain. He presents the schema of titles justifying the wars and so on. And this schema is almost copied verbatim or followed by these kind of epigons that are the American scholastics. But this is not true due to many reasons. One of them is that already in the 1570s, in the Alpujarras War,
there is a connection between all the regions of the empire. So they are going to use in Chile, and I wrote here other paragraph. Let me see if I write. Yeah. For example, you can find here the assimilation that he made of the Mapuche, other Native American rebels, and the Moriscos. Why? Because the Moriscos, they were also vassals of the Spanish kings. They were in process of conversion. They were neophytos, and if you look to scholastic sources in the past, in the Middle Ages, up to my knowledge, we don't find justifications for the enslavement of this kind of vassals, neophytes. But after the Morisco revolt, there is a decision, a royal decision from Philip II, authorizing the enslavement of the Mapuche and the distribution of the Morisco population of the Moriscos among Castilian families, especially the children. Yeah, and this logic is the slave lobby in America. They say, well, this is very useful for us. Why, if you have decreed the sanction of slavery for the Moriscos and for other populations in Brazil, in Peru, and why not the Chichimeca in Mexico, or why not the Mapuche in Chile? Because they are rebels, and the religious title that they invent in this period is the one of apostasy. That if one was Christian and in a certain moment has made apostasy, it can be enslaved. This is linked to canon law, because in the Decretum Gratiani there is a clause authorizing the enslavement of the merchant who is selling weapons to the infidels, to the Moors. And they take this little clause of the Decretum Gratiani to justify also the enslavement of apostates. But this is a radical novelty, in my opinion. I don't know, perhaps in your medieval cases you have seen authorization of slaves in other contexts that were vassals and in process of conversion.
Yeah, thank you. Does this work? Yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry, I have to disappoint you in my talk. I won't talk about the chapters on monarchy, like Politics, Book 5, Chapter 10 and 11. And the reason is, you're totally right. I mean, Machiavelli took a lot from Aristotle's, these two chapters in Aristotle, but there is a comprehensive research by Dolf Sternberger in his. I have all the bibliographical stuff in my PowerPoints in his book Drei Wurzeln der Politik, like 3 roots of politics, where he over many pages he takes to the left he puts Aristotle's text, and to the right he puts quotes from Machiavelli, and he shows how much Machiavelli, we would nowadays say plagiarized, but he put lots of things from Polybius, etc., partly like literal quotes without saying this is like the anakykloses, etc., whereas he's not giving his source. But I mean, there is I want to talk about other stuff, but I'm just saying you're perfectly right, and there has been a comprehensive research by Dolf Sternberg. I just don't want to present his research, which is already published.
Thank you.
Other observation, nothing? If no, thank you. Maybe it was a perfect conclusion, I think, of what we started saying yesterday about tyranny, that it was a necessity to consider all the regimes, and so we have also to see the approaching of tyranny to monarchy, also to consider what is wrong with a king also, and what is right in a tyrant.
Thank you, Lydia.
Thank you. Thank you.